Chapter 1454. Yura, Eek suddenly said, "Take our daughter and leave first." "I have to stay. I'm the master of this place, and I have to be responsible for the guests. If I leave, Bernacle will be in chaos. The prince is still here, and he's here because the princess trusts us. I have to ensure their safety." Yura nodded silently. "Be careful." "I understand," Eek smiled gently. "Even if it's for our daughter, I won't risk my life so easily. If things go south, I'll catch up with you." Yura finally relaxed. Her expression was calm as usual, but she gripped her husband's pale hand tightly. It showed her true feelings. They soon arrived at the bottom of the mansion. In a secret room, a middle-aged knight was already waiting for them. He obviously entered through the secret passage that connected the mansion to the outside. When Eek saw the man, he was pleasantly surprised. "Mr. Corsica, is Uncle Makarov here?" "Mr. Eek, you're finally here. The attack outside was out of our expectations. Mr. Makarov wanted to come himself, but we stopped him. He's now in the direction of the city hall. He asked me to bring you some words, but it's not the time for that. We've already guarded the entrance of the secret passage. Mister, please move to a safer place first before we talk." The middle-aged knight replied with a straight face. Eek held his wife's hand. After a moment of silence, he let go and took his daughter from the wet nurse. He solemnly handed the most precious treasure in the world to Yura. "Go, Yura. It'll be fine." "Yes. Mr. Eek, you?" "I'll stay, Mr. Corsica. Prince Heroes is still outside. Whether the knight has the situation under control or not, I have to go and take a look." The middle-aged knight looked at him with a complicated expression. "All right, I'll go with you, Mr. Eek." He turned around and said to the knight beside him, "Escort the lady and the young lady out of here. Protect them well." "Understood, sir." The two knights nodded immediately. With that, the knight opened the secret tunnel. Yura carried Ella in first, followed by the wet nurse and the two servants. Finally, they followed in and closed the door from the inside. "Thank you, Mr. Corsica," Eek said with a sense of loss after seeing his wife disappear behind the secret door. "You're welcome, Master Eek. Let's go. I'll send you off." The middle-aged knight replied calmly. Eek was slightly stunned. Just as he was about to turn around, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his back. The young Duke of Anthony widened his eyes in shock as he stared in disbelief at the bloody blade protruding from his chest. In an instant, he felt all the strength in his body leave him. He opened his mouth with difficulty and immediately spat out a mouthful of blood mixed with pieces of his internal organs. "Why, Mr. Makarov asked me to pass a message to you, Master Eek. He said that he regrets teaching you so much about the spirit of a knight. Your righteousness and kindness made him happy, but Erwin is not someone who can be saved by innocence and righteousness." The middle-aged knight replied calmly. Erwin is not the only Erwin of the Corvado royal family. Master Eek, do you want to see the Ophelia family reduced to ashes in your hands? So I'm sorry. Sometimes, only blood can redeem everything, Uncle Makarov. Grandmaster Fleetwood. Eek's eyes were filled with tears. He opened his mouth wide and tried to breathe as if he was trying to grab onto something. He slowly reached out his hand and seemed to see the face of his wife and daughter in the endless darkness. Yura, the candle was extinguished. It became silent in the darkness. The middle-aged knight sighed and gently pulled out the dagger from the young man's cold corpse. Then, he held him with both hands and carefully laid him flat on the ground. He drew a symbol of the golden flame on his chest and forehead with his hand and chanted something in a low voice. Finally, he took off his coat and covered the body of the young duke who would sleep forever. "Erwin's future," he said softly, "perhaps he will walk a different path." There is only right, and there is no justice. In the darkness, the secret door was opened once more. He stepped in and took one last look at the room before closing the secret door. Everything in the basement returned to eternal silence at this moment. Behind the secret door, the middle-aged knight walked silently in a long corridor. He took off his bloody gloves and threw them away. Soon, a light appeared in front of him. His knight subordinates were waiting for him there. However, the knight was obviously a little flustered, and his face was even a little pale. When he saw this, his expression changed slightly, and he subconsciously looked around. There were 4 corpses lying on the ground. 2 of the attendants had their throats slit, and the wet nurse was stabbed in the back and fell in a pool of blood. However, the last corpse was not the Duchess, but one of his subordinates. What happened? The middle-aged knight was furious. Where is Miss Yura? I don't know, the knight replied nervously. The Duchess suddenly started sobbing when we were halfway there. We were afraid that something might happen, so we had to act first. But he didn't expect that after killing those servants, Rowan would suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream. By the time I lit the torch, he had already become like this. Trash. The middle-aged knight flipped over the corpse of his subordinate and found a sharp dagger stuck in his waist. That dagger had actually pierced through the thick chain armor and killed him in one blow. It was a clean kill. He took a deep breath and stood up. What are you waiting for, you idiot? Hurry up and inform the Magi. Yes, sir. I'll go now. The knight was relieved and ran out of the room. Dirty water flowed in the dark. The underground drainage system of Bernasol had been in disrepair for half a century. Rubbish and debris had piled up into mountains. Water seeped out from the top of the sewer and dripped onto the damp ground, emitting a nauseating stench. Carglass held a glowing moonstone in his hand and scanned the dark tunnel with its cold light. From time to time, he saw a large group of rats running through the tunnel. It was a chilling sight. He furrowed his brows. This sewer was built about 100 or 200 years ago. Ever since Vero was annexed to Aween, this place had been forgotten along with the abandonment of the fortress. The sewer system that had lost its repair was collapsing everywhere, and it was full of danger. There were also unknown monsters hiding in the dark. The purple liquid on his sword was actually the blood of a ghoul. That thing was too dangerous. If there were a few more of them, he might not be able to handle it. Of course, he was fine by himself. The problem was that he had to take care of his 2 children. I should have let Prince Haruz pick up a sword too. I shouldn't have blindly shown off. His swordsmanship was taught by the Count himself. How bad could it be? Carglass felt that he was really unlucky. Even his mind was starting to become muddled. Fortunately, the little girl who led them was very reliable. They didn't come to any dead ends along the way. Carglass realized that the little girl named Micaiah was even neater than a commoner's daughter. How could she live in such a filthy place? He vaguely felt that he had been tricked, but he couldn't tell why. They walked in the sewers for almost half an hour, and it was at this time that Micaiah suddenly stopped. What's wrong? Carglass asked. There are people ahead, the little girl replied calmly. Who? The people we met at the banquet. How did you know? Carglass asked in surprise. He didn't even know where they were, but the little girl had already determined their identity. How was that possible? Unless the little girl's true strength was actually higher than his. Because I ran out of magic, Micaiah replied. I've been using dark magic to avoid them, but now I can't. I can only feel that they are approaching us. What? Carglass thought that he must have misheard something. Or maybe he was still dreaming. Actually, Micaiah is a witch, Haruz replied with a bitter smile. Mr. Carglass. What? Carglass finally understood what went wrong. He felt like an idiot who had been played for a fool. You mean to say that you're actually a subordinate of his lordship? The little girl tilted her head and stuck out her tongue at him. Carglass felt like a little devil when he saw her adorable actions. Damn it, Carglass suddenly stopped talking. He put up a finger and gestured for Heroes to keep quiet. There are footsteps. He raised his head toward the road, then carefully shielded Heroes and Micaiah behind him. He turned back and asked in a low voice, "Are you sure it's those people?" Micaiah nodded. "Is there any way to avoid them?" The little girl thought for a moment. "I've lost my magic. If we continue to move forward now, they will be alerted. Then if we hide here, will they be able to detect us?" "If they don't pay attention, perhaps not," Micaiah replied. "The perception of wizards is not much stronger than ordinary people, and the same goes for the silver folk. But if they use magic to detect us, we will have nowhere to hide." Chapter 1455. Carglass's face darkened. He gritted his teeth and decided that he was not going to take the risk. Thinking of this, he said, "You guys stay here. I'll lure them away. If there's a chance, you guys run, do you understand?" "Mr. Carglass, you can't, shut up." The sloppy young noble from Trondheim showed a serious expression for the first time. He even interrupted Heroes without mercy. "Your Highness Heroes, now is not the time to discuss whether or not we can do it. Every one of us is in danger, but if we don't try our best to fight for it, we will really die here." He patted Heroes' shoulder. "Do you understand, Your Majesty?" "Aye." Heroes nodded. "I understand, Mr. Carglass." Then it settled. Carglass turned the sword around and handed it to Heroes. "If I can't escape, this sword means nothing to me. Take it and protect the lady beside you." Heroes nodded resolutely. He wanted to say something, but Carglass waved his hand at him and disappeared into the darkness. Heroes closed his mouth tightly. He held the sword tightly in his hand as if it was the only thing he could rely on. His knuckles turned white as he tried to hold back his tears. His teacher had told him that a man should not cry easily. Then he felt a cold hand on the back of his hand. "That guy, he'll be fine." Heroes turned his head in surprise and looked at Micaiah, who had a calm face. "Lady Marcia is fair to everything in this world. He's an idiot, so his luck will definitely be better." The little girl replied softly as if she was telling a truth, "Lady Marcia is fair to everything in this world. He's a fool, so his luck will definitely be better." "Ha!" Micaiah made a shoot gesture at him. Heroes was so scared that he shut his mouth again. He turned around and heard an angry voice coming from the darkness. The footsteps seemed to be fading away. Heroes could feel his heart beating so fast that it felt like it was going to explode. He bit his lower lip and prayed for Carglass. But after a while, all the sounds disappeared, and the darkness returned to silence. Micaiah suddenly grabbed his wrist. "Let's go," she said quickly. Before Heroes could react, a dazzling light swept over from the darkness. Although it did not shine on the two of them, their hiding place was exposed. A sharp voice rang out, "Ha, there are still some fish that escaped the net. Come out." At that moment, Heroes felt his mind go blank. He thought he was going to die, but everything he had learned seemed to appear naturally in his mind. He did not even have to think about it. He subconsciously raised his hand to the ceiling of the underground tunnel and shouted, "I'm going to kill you." A black light shot out from the prince's palm and hit the ceiling that had long been eroded by the underground water. There was a loud bang, and a bucket of dirty water burst out from the ceiling. Large pieces of rubble fell from the ceiling and quickly turned into a large area of collapse. In an instant, it was as if the entire ceiling had fallen. The torrent instantly sent Heroes and Micaiah flying. The former hit a stone pillar and almost screamed out in pain. But at this time, Heroes didn't dare to stop. Ignoring the pain in his back that felt like it was breaking, he jumped out of the water, rushed over and grabbed Micaiah's hand, shouting, "Run!" The two stumbled forward, and a moment later, there was the sound of a second explosion behind them. The flying stones crossed a distance of tens of meters and hit the wall. Some stones even hit Haru's back, turning him purple and black in an instant. But he did not dare to stop. He knew that the second explosion must be the gray mage catching up. Sure enough, an angry voice came from that direction. "Black magic." The sharp voice shouted, "Very well, I'd like to see who it is." Haruz felt his soul leaving his body. He knew very well that with his level of strength, he was no match for the Bugha silver person. He could only hope that the intricate terrain here would make the other party confused, although it seemed unlikely. The two of them quickly ran until they were out of breath, but Micaiah was unexpectedly strong. The little girl didn't say a word from beginning to end, although it was clearly because of him that she was in danger. "I'm sorry, Micaiah." Haruz panted and apologized, I can't run anymore. "It's all because of me that you're like this." He originally thought that Micaiah would retort, but he didn't expect that his hand would grab empty air. Haruz was so scared that he almost screamed. He thought that the gray mage had caught up and subconsciously raised his sword to stab behind him. But unexpectedly, a hand reached out from the darkness, knocked the long sword out of his hand, and then grabbed his arm and pulled him over. Haruz opened his mouth to scream in fright, but his mouth was covered by a soft hand, so that he could only let out a whimper. But at this time, he finally realized that the person who grabbed him was not the gray mage, because he clearly felt that the hand covering his mouth was a woman's hand. "Sister Lasmika?" Haruz asked subconsciously. But a gentle voice, completely different from Lady Medusa's, rang out in the darkness, "Don't talk, Your Highness." Haruz was slightly startled. He looked around and realized that he was in a narrow secret room. Not only him, but Micaiah was also in this place. Between the two of them was a very tall woman. She held Haruz in her arms with her eyes closed, and in her other hand was a baby girl in swaddling clothes. Haruz recognized who the other party was in an instant. "Oh, Madam Ophelia." "Shoot," Yura said softly, and she gently let go of Haruz. Only then did Haruz notice that the other party was injured. A wound extended from her shoulder to her chest, and blood had already soaked her clothes. She frowned, as if her previous movements had affected the wound, but even so, she bent down slightly, held the baby girl in her arms with both hands, and then handed her to Haruz. "This is..." In the darkness, Haruz's silver eyes sparkled, and he asked the Duchess with a puzzled look. "We can't hide," Yura said softly. Eula replied softly, "You are a guest of Lantanailan. Eichel and I must ensure your safety." Before she finished speaking, as if to confirm her words, the previous sharp voice came from outside the secret room. "How ridiculous, trying to hide in front of a real wizard, like a mouse with nowhere to hide under the light. Come out." Yura stretched out her hand and stopped Haruz. "The guest follows the host's wishes," she replied softly. "This is the ancient saying of the 9 phoenixes." With that, she gently touched her daughter's forehead, stood up, opened the door of the secret room, and walked out. The heavy stone door closed with a rumble in front of Haruz and Micaiah's eyes. Haruz clenched his teeth and held the baby girl in his arms tightly. His chest rose and fell slightly, but he could not make the slightest sound. Finally, the voice of the gray wizard came from outside the door again. The other party seemed a little surprised. "Look at what I found. This is not a small prey. A person of the 9 phoenix, a person chosen by the heavens, and a blind person. Then, this lady should be Duchess Ophelia, right?" Lady Yura did not seem to answer. Then the voice asked again, "Where is your daughter, Lady Yura? As a mother, do you think I would give my daughter to people like you, a Bugha, to be so self-degrading?" The man seemed to be strangely silent for a moment because of this sentence. Then he said, I admit that you are right, Duchess, but the silver folk also have their own choices. It may be a little dishonorable, but in this world, everything cannot be won fair and square. Otherwise, how could we, the descendants of the ancient people, have fallen to such a state today? Everyone has their own choices, yes, Yura replied. But some people are noble because of it, and some are despicable because of it. Do you know what I have gained the most from coming to this land, Mr. Wizard? What is that? It is all the love in this world, deep and passionate, plain and noble. Do you understand all this, Mr. Wizard? Ah, the Grey Wizard sighed. I understand, Lady Yura, you will certainly choose to sacrifice yourself to protect your daughter, but you have to understand that it means nothing to us. There was a moment of silence outside the door. Yura seemed to say something in a low voice. It was the ancient saying of the 9 phoenixes. The Grey Wizard was slightly surprised. What did you say? But this sentence stopped abruptly and suddenly turned into a scream of horror. Damn it, what are you doing? Stop it. At that moment, Heartwarming felt the scorching heat in the secret room, but in his hands, the baby girl still had her eyes closed, as peaceful as a dream. A moment later, there was a shrill scream outside the door, and then everything was quiet. In the darkness, Mikhail was surprisingly calm. It's all over. At that moment, Heartwarming suddenly understood something. He trembled slightly and closed his eyes in pain. A drop of tear rolled down his long eyelashes and fell on the forehead of the baby girl in his arms. The baby girl suddenly woke up, her eyes still closed. She cried out and reached out her little hand, even touching the edge of Heartwarming's palm. Heartwarming bit his lips so hard that it almost bled. He held the baby girl's little hand and replied, Elara, I will avenge your mother, no matter where those guys came from. The little prince's voice was low and sorrowful, almost pausing after every word. I swear. He was silent for a moment. I swear in the name of King Erwin. At that moment, the baby girl suddenly opened her eyes. In the darkness, it was a pair of shining golden eyes. Heartwarming was stunned. This is the golden race. I see. Mikhail suddenly crawled over to Heartwarming's side. She reached out her hand and gently stroked the baby girl's forehead. She is not a golden race. This is a descendant tainted with the power of Twilight, the first generation born after the collapse of Tiamat's network. In the darkness, the little girl's voice was soft and steady. I see. This is the choice of this world, where the hope of the future lies. Chapter 1456. Early in the morning, the dew that had accumulated overnight rolled down from the olive leaves. Startled birds flew out of the forest, and the sound of horse hooves approached from afar. On the main road near Castle Greypine, Maggie saw a grey knight galloping towards them. The castle lowered the drawbridge and pulled up the gate. The knight went straight into the gate and then dismounted from his horse. He didn't care about sweating profusely. He handed his mount to the guard and took off his cloak. He walked up the tower and handed a letter to the clerk sitting there. After the clerk verified that the mark was correct, his expression changed. He reached out to ring the bell, then got up, opened the door behind him, and hurried out. The urgent document was passed between the towers, and soon it fell into the hands of the servants in the inner court. Under the lead of 2 female officials, the servants knocked on the heavy wooden door of Castle Greypine's Lothar Palace. The few people inside the door stopped talking and turned to look at them in unison. Is this news from Lantern Island? Amandina asked with a serious expression when she saw the blue ribbon on the scroll in the servant's hand. Yes, Madam Amandina, Your Highness, this is urgent news from Lantern Island. Freyo looked at Princess Griffin. The half-elf girl had an uneasy look on her face. Only then did she walk down the steps and take the tray. After Levin one's son returned to Cypher, the process of the unification of the North and the South had already been put on the table, but the nobles in the South still had doubts about it. Many of them expressed their wish to communicate with the royal family before the peace talks in Ampere Seal. Although Allium Japonicum had doubts about this matter, because Ranner was too close to Grenoires, and now in this southern province, the activities of the pagans were becoming more and more active. But she also understood that the situation in the south had reached a boiling point, and the royal family statement was necessary to ease the increasing tension. Fortunately, the White Lion Guards had always been present in Ranner, and since the end of the Second War of the Black Roses, Brunhilde and her Valkyries seemed to be satisfied with the situation. Therefore, after compromising, the Allium Japonicum allowed Freya, who had just returned, to accompany Amandine and Princess Griffine on the trip to Ranner. Her Royal Highness's entourage set out. The ambassadors of Billentonnelan left Fraudepesci a week later, and did not reach Radnor until the latter part of the month of the slumber. At this time, it was already around the new year, but after the baptism of war, there was no New Year's atmosphere. The situation in the south seemed to be more serious than expected. Just after the end of the year, there was a pagan riot in the Winnomar region. Coupled with the sudden interruption of news from Lantern Island's shallow water town, the White Lion Guard's defense and attention were diverted to the east. This alerted Amandine. Under her suggestion, Brunhilde and her Valkyrie riders had moved their garrisons 3 times in a row, and now they were extremely close to the north of Greypine Castle. However, the tense situation and the lack of news from Lantern Island made Princess Griffine more and more worried about the safety of her brother, the future King Erwin. These days, she had less and less time to sleep peacefully. And this urgent letter from Lantern Island seemed to faintly indicate something, causing the entire high-arched hall of Lothargar Palace to fall silent. The air seemed to be filled with an uneasy message. Amandina's gaze moved back and forth between the letter and her Royal Highness. She pursed her lips, faintly calculating something in her heart. Freya carried the tray with both hands and walked back to her Royal Highness. Griffin nodded to her. Although she tried to appear calm, her slightly furrowed brows showed the fluctuations in her heart. She picked up the letter, opened the wax seal, and shook out the real secret letter. She had only read 2 lines when her hand trembled slightly, and she accidentally knocked over the gold-plated cup on the table. With a crisp bang, the cup rolled to the ground, clinking all the way to Freya's feet. Only then did the Valkyrie bend down and reach out to hold it down, stopping the sudden noise in the empty hall. Griffin's face was as white as a sheet, and she almost fell backward with her head raised. Fortunately, Amandine was quick to react and rushed forward to support the former. "Your Royal Highness." Freya picked up the cup and looked up. Only then did she see this scene and could not help but be startled. "Your Royal Highness." The maids and chamberlains also exclaimed. But Amandine sternly reprimanded these servants. "Leave, inform the priest to come over immediately, and remember to keep your mouths shut." Amandine was no longer the destitute noble daughter who brags. A few months ago, the heads that rolled on the ground in Ranner had forged her reputation here. The chamberlains and maids did not dare to disobey her orders and immediately retreated in fear. "Go see if the door is closed, Freya." Amandine helped the pale-faced princess sit down and then instructed. The Valkyrie understood and immediately checked to see if anyone was eavesdropping. Then she turned around and shook her head. "Go find out the news." Amandine gave her a look. Freya nodded, then pushed the door open and walked out. After Freya left, Amandine asked, "Your Royal Highness." "Something happened to Heroes." Princess Griffin murmured. "What happened?" "There was a rebellion in Bernisel, and the thugs took over the city. Old Duke Tonlan's army has now surrounded the city, but they have not attacked the city." Ever since this letter was sent, Heroes has lost contact with Duke Aiko and the others for 3 days. So, Amandine breathed a sigh of relief, at least the worst-case scenario she imagined had not happened. His Royal Highness may not have really met with misfortune. But how did these thugs come? Isn't there a large number of troops stationed in Lantern Island? Weren't the Highland Knight and the Black Tower mages also invited to the ceremony? I'm not sure. Griffin finally recovered some of her composure at this time and seemed a little calmer. She carefully recalled the contents of the letter, then shook her head weakly. The letter was written by Count Rogadia. According to the Highland Knight, the old Duke has not yet figured out the identity of the attackers. It is said that there is a considerable possibility that they are local pagans, but there are a large number of mages among them. That is why the Highland Knight and Lantern Island's allied forces have been defeated repeatedly. The Duke of Lantern Island is really confused. How can the local pagans have such strength? There must be an external force behind this, Amandina concluded. When did this happen, Your Royal Highness? It has been a week since the letter was sent. Princess Griffin frowned at this time. Strange, why was this letter delayed on the road for 3 days? Where is the knight who delivered the letter? We will know soon. Amandina looked up. Her frown seemed to reflect the same uneasiness in her heart, but even so, her answer was still unusually firm. As if to prove her words, not a moment later, Freya pushed the door open and walked in with the same worried look on her face. The female knight carefully closed the heavy wooden door of Lothargar Palace with the back of her hand, until the huge maple door made a soft click, and the lock springs were locked tightly with each other. Then Freya turned around and said, Your Royal Highness, Amandina, I have asked clearly. This letter was sent to Magidon after it was sent to Fort Kirkle. Why would a letter from Lantern Island to Magidon be sent to Fort Kirkle? The princess frowned and questioned with slight dissatisfaction. Isn't the shortest route between these two places the mountain path that passes through the Dwarven Circle? Who was the one who deliberately delayed the timing? The female knight shook her head. Because its first messenger is already dead. An unknown army blocked the road to the north of the Misty Forest, and the knight who delivered the letter risked his life to break through their blockade to deliver the letter to Kirkle. Then, it was sent to us by Lord Sherman Cohen's men. Actually, Freya said with a frown, we may be in trouble, Your Royal Highness. Amandina could not help but interrupt. Freya, you said that an unknown army was inserted to the north of Magidon. Are you sure that the messenger is telling the truth? I have confirmed his secret signal, and the magic method used is exactly the method that Lord Sherman taught Cohen. Amandina sucked in a breath of cold air, but why did the White Lion Guards not know anything about it? Because the movement of the believers of Manowar's All for One attracted our attention. Freya had clearly sorted out her thoughts, so this can only be the army of Duke Grenoir's and the Southern Legion. Other than that, there is no other army of such strength in the south. Amandina thought for a moment and said, this is obviously a premeditated move. The other party may be in cahoots with the rebels of Lantern Island, and they can order the believers of All for One in Erewhon. More importantly, they can march in secret under our noses, which means that they at least have the help of the local nobles. Amandina felt her scalp tingle. The nobles of the south colluding with each other was the last thing she wanted to see. It almost meant a coup d'état and rebellion. But now, there was no such thing as luck. The other party's large-scale mobilization in the south was definitely not as simple as an armed parade. And the most chilling thing was that Valhalla's military and administrative forces were completely kept in the dark in this incident. This was not something that could be explained by an intelligence failure. This could only mean that the other party's organization was more efficient and stronger than Valhalla. This may be pardonable. After all, Valhalla's intelligence system was only gradually established after Lord Sherman Cohen joined. Although there was some support from the Bugis, it was still a short time after all. Chapter 1457. But even so, it was the most effective force in Erewhon. The old noble's intelligence system was riddled with holes and could not withstand a single blow from it. Who, then, could make Valhalla appear blind? And it might not be just that. Because she understood that it was the royal faction behind this meeting. Even if the local nobles were determined to break off relations with the royal family, even if they could hide from the royal family's spies, the inextricable connections between them could not be completely hidden from the higher-ups of the royal faction. Unless someone had purposely blindfolded the eyes of others, creating an artificial illusion behind the carefully concealed truth. Someone betrayed us. Princess Griffin also understood everything. She bit her lips tightly, and a trace of pain flashed across her face. When we went to Ranner, at least one of the courtiers in charge of communicating and coordinating with the local nobles hid the most crucial information from us and betrayed us. The princess clenched her fists tightly, because she had almost guessed the person's name. That was the elder she once trusted the most, the teacher and senior in her eyes, and the example of the nobles in Erewhon whom she had always admired the most. She almost did not want to say that name, because it would hurt all her fantasies and memories of the kingdom's past. Maybe it's not necessarily that person. Amandina instantly understood what she meant, and softly comforted her. Your Highness, you must muster up your courage at this time. Although Amandina herself did not quite believe this comfort. Both Makarov and Count Audine had the opportunity to come into contact with the inside story, but in comparison, that person was closer to the heart of the royal court. And after the all-for-one movement in Manuel, Oberway personally wrote a letter to say that the Duke of Grenoir's and the Southern Army's movements were all normal. Now, this letter seemed to have become the bloody handprint on the evidence of the crime. But this handprint may have already strangled the Erewhon royal family today. Her Royal Highness stood up. She felt a little suffocated. There were many local nobles and participants gathered in Mageddon City. How many of these people were rebels or at least sympathizers of the rebels? She shuddered just thinking about it. Did the other party already know that the messenger from Anthony had arrived in Grapine Castle? Perhaps they had already secretly sent people to monitor the manor. Amandina seemed to have realized the severity of the situation. She cautiously looked out of the arched window at the side of the hall and whispered, "We have to find a way to move to a safe place." Fortunately, Lady Brunhilde's camp is not far from here, and there are trustworthy White Lion guards in the castle. Griffin shook her head. There were too few White Lion guards in the city. They mainly relied on the guards in the castle, but these guards might not be reliable at this time. She asked, "Can you find a way to contact Miss Brunhild?" "There's a messaging crystal." Freya immediately removed the White Lion brooch from her chest, but when she turned it over, her expression changed. On the other side of the silver brooch, there was a dark red gem embedded in it. At that moment, it was dull, as though it had lost its effectiveness. Someone blocked the magic network in this area. Amandina and Griffin's expressions changed at the same time. The other party had already made a move, and the matter of the messenger could not be hidden. It was normal for there to be a potential informant in the castle, but it also meant that their current situation was very dangerous. "We have to leave this place immediately." Amandina made a prompt decision. But the secret passageway might not be safe either. The secret passageway in Castle Grapine is meant for external enemies. If the local nobles are also against us, this secret passageway might not be usable. Freya replied cautiously. "We have another way." Griffin had completely recovered by now. She thought for a moment and said, "In fact, most castles have more than one secret passage. Grapine Castle used to be the property of Count Ranner, but it was built by the previous count. In the era when Ranner's territory was close to the royal family, my father came here a few times. Because of a coincidence, he found out about a secret passage that only the Ranner family knows about. This secret passage leads to the Misty Forest." At this point, the princess could not help but blush. Amandina and Freya happened to hear about the love affair between Ober VII and Count Ranner when he was young. It was obvious that this secret passage was the bridge between the two of them. However, Amandina and Erewhon's war goddess did not say anything and pretended that they did not understand the meaning behind it. Amandina coughed lightly and said to Freya, "Freya, go and gather the White Lion guards. Gather as many people as you can, but there's no need to take any risks. Don't think that you can get everyone out of here by chance. As for the others in the castle, you don't have to inform them. Tell them that the princess wants to gather the royal faction and the nobles. Tell them that she has something to announce. I understand. I'll go and destroy the documents and letters. Amandina replied, apart from the parts that must be taken away, the rest must be burned on the spot. Let me help you, Miss Amandina. Griffin sighed softly. She suddenly felt weak and powerless. This feeling was similar to the despair she felt when she was betrayed in Ampere Seal. But this time, at least she had someone by her side to rely on. However, she could not help but wonder if the knight who saved her and Erwin time and time again was as brilliant and dazzling as he appeared to be. Amandina looked at her and shook her head. First, you have to sort out your emotions. You can't be in this state right now. Also, you have to put on some makeup. Your elven features are too obvious. Do you know how to put on makeup, Your Highness? A little. Amandina shook her head. I'll let my maid help you. She's someone I brought from Tonagel. She's a reliable person. Griffin could only nod. Ever since Count Randner's death, the huge family had fallen apart. Their immediate family members were either imprisoned or hanged by the royal faction in the name of rebellion. It took Griffin some time to find the entrance to the secret passage in the Count's study. It was obvious that the princess' father did not mention much about it. The entrance to the secret passage was in the wall behind the fireplace. The fireplace was cleverly designed to be movable. Once it was opened, it revealed a dark entrance behind it. Griffin was certain that the passage had not been opened since that era because it represented a disgraceful history for the Randner family. When she saw the thick layer of dust and cobwebs at the entrance, she knew that her guess was correct. However, standing in front of the entrance, the princess felt a moment of absent-mindedness. She thought that perhaps decades ago, her father had also stepped into this pitch-black staircase when he was young. A father and a daughter, at two different times and with two different emotions, stepped into the same secret passage. It gave her a sense of dislocation in time. Today, this secret passage was still the same, but to Erwin, things had changed. Those who belonged to the past left the stage one by one, and their lives ended. This included her father, Erwin's father, Oberg VII. At that moment, she recalled her childhood. She recalled the series of events that happened after she left Corvado. It was as if it was just yesterday. Will there be a day when I will leave this world, father? When Griffin took that step, such a thought appeared in her mind. Apart from Amandina and Freya, there were a total of 17 people accompanying them. One of them was Amandina's maid, while the rest were the Knights of the White Lion Squad. Originally, there should have been more people, but the rebels seemed to be aware of their intentions and started a riot in Grey Pine Castle in advance. After a fierce battle, they defeated the guards in the castle, and there were only a few people left, and almost all of them were injured. Is this secret passage really safe? Amandina suddenly asked in the darkness. Only a few people in the Randner family know about it. Griffin paused for a moment before continuing. Regardless of whether this passage is safe or not, this is our only choice. If I knew this would happen, I would have let Lady Brunhilde and the others stay in the castle. Freya replied with a hint of frustration. Unless you want them to be exposed to the world, Griffin forced a smile. Mr. Brando won't agree to it. Besides, Lady Brunhilde and the others are indeed a little special. There was silence in the darkness. The Buddhists only spoke a few words to ease the uneasiness between them, but the ladies soon stopped talking to each other. Only the sound of chaotic footsteps could be heard. The passage was a flight of stairs that led downwards. The knights used gems that emitted a cold light to illuminate the stairs. Soon, they found themselves in a natural cave. Fortunately, the terrain here was not too complicated. The underground water of Castle Greypine seemed to be stored under the karst cave. In the darkness, there were large pools of water. Stalactites rose from the pools and densely covered the ceiling of the cave. The cave was as rumored to lead straight to the north, and there were traces of man-made carvings along the way. Griffin breathed a sigh of relief. Her father did not tell her about the anecdotes of his youth, and she was only able to determine the location of this place through fragments of words. She was afraid that her judgment would be wrong, but fortunately, everything was developing in a good direction. Chapter 1458. About an hour later, the knight finally brought news from the front. An exit has been found, Your Highness. Looks like we found the right place. Amandina also saw the princess's nervousness and comforted her. Although the process is a little complicated, at least we haven't lost all hope. From Duke Anthony's reaction in the letter, at least they're still on our side. With the military power of Valhalla, these schemes and plots can only stay at the stage of schemes and plots. Thank you, Amandina. I understand, I'm just worried about Haruz. He's the Lord's student, and the Lord didn't just teach Prince Haruz swordsmanship. As his sister, perhaps Your Highness should have more confidence in Erewhon's future king. Aween's eldest princess finally nodded her head. The knight soon controlled the exit of the secret passage from outside. The exit was indeed in the misty forest, and it was said that there was a hunter's wooden house nearby, but it had been abandoned for a long time. The Knight of the White Lion Guards found a lot of military standard weapons in the wooden house. Although they had long rusted, it seemed that this was a secret stronghold of the Ranner family, and the appearance was just a cover. After confirming this, Amandina and Princess Griffin were finally able to calm down. Under the care of the knight, Freya was the first of the three to walk out of the secret passage, and then the Valkyrie took the princess' hand and helped her out. Although the eyes of the elves could quickly adapt to the changes in light intensity, Princess Griffin could not help but squint under the sudden sunlight. And at this moment, she suddenly heard a sharp whistle in her ear. Your Highness, be careful. She heard Freya's scream, and then a heavy object crashed into her. The huge force made her fall back, and her back hit the wall of the secret passage heavily. Then, a series of noises came from outside. One of them was probably the sound of wind and fire, followed by the sound of people screaming, and finally the sound of weapons clashing. She heard the Valkyrie let out a muffled groan. After that, all sounds died down. Only then did the princess see what was on top of her. It was a corpse, a headless corpse of a white lion knight. Blood was oozing out of the broken blood vessels and trachea on the neck. The stench was nauseating. Griffin resisted the urge to vomit. She tried her best to shrink back, but Amandina also tried to pull her back. Soon, a pair of cold iron gloves reached in from outside the cave and grabbed the princess' hair. Griffin let out a scream and was dragged out of the cave. She screamed and clawed at the wall. Her fingertips were bleeding, but she was still pulled out and thrown aside. Griffin opened her eyes and saw Freya lying next to her with her eyes closed. There was a long wound on her chest, and she did not know if she was dead or alive. Griffin's heart clenched. She subconsciously held the Valkyrie's cold hand. Fortunately, she could still see a warm pulse. But before she could say anything, the pair of iron gloves grabbed her slender neck and pulled her up. Then, she shouted in the direction of the cave. Everyone inside, come out, or I'll kill these people. Griffin felt that her face, which had been hit earlier, was swollen and painful. She could barely open her eyes, but she still saw Amandina and two other knights slowly walking out of the secret passage. Of the more than 10 people who had accompanied her, only a few were left in an instant. Griffin saw the cold corpses on the ground. Among them was Amandina's maid. This girl, who was only 15 or 16 years old, had been shot in the chest by an arrow. Her empty eyes stared straight at the sky above the forest. Griffin thought of how this girl had put on makeup for her not long ago and praised her beauty. She could not help but close her eyes in pain. The other party's strength was beyond her imagination. The White Lion guards left behind by Brando were already one of the best elites in Erewhon. The average local noble's private army might not be able to gain the upper hand in a head-on battle even if they had 10 times the number. But these enemies had killed almost all of them in a moment. She noticed that most of the people who attacked were wizards. There were a total of 17 or 18 people, all dressed in grey robes, and even their faces were covered by hoods. With so many spellcasters, it was exactly the same as the rebellion in Lantern Island described in the Highland Knight's letter. This was definitely not something that the local nobles in the Southern Territory could come up with. "Who is the princess?" The black-armored knight who caught her asked in a rough, muffled voice. Griffin was slightly startled. She looked up with some doubt. These people who came to arrest them did not recognize her. Were they really the nobles of Erewhon? "Take the women away." "There must be someone among the nobles who knows her," a voice replied. "No," but the wizards shook their heads. "These people cannot be seen by the nobles. They are our captives. Don't worry, we have ways to confirm their identities." With that, he motioned to one of the wizards to take out a gemstone. Griffin almost cried out when she saw the gemstone. It was Gorland's gemstone. Legend had it that it used to be a part of the Lionheart sword, but the late King Eric used it to cast a crown. This crown had always been the treasure of the Cipher family. The gemstone had the same ability as the Lionheart sword, which was to confirm the legitimacy of the Erewhon royal family. The crown had always been in the Cipher family, but after the war in Ampere Seal, following a series of turmoil in the Cipher family, the crown and the gemstone disappeared. Griffin had specifically asked her brother Levin Orson about this. Ornizon, but the other party obviously didn't know much about this matter. But how did it fall into the hands of these people? Who were these people? Griffin's heart was filled with confusion for a moment. Amandina also saw the gemstone at this time, and a trace of surprise flashed in her eyes. She saw the black-armored knight receiving the gemstone from the Magi. She suddenly stepped forward and interrupted them, saying, "Don't worry. This is Gorland's gemstone. It is the treasure of the Erewhon family. How did it fall into your hands? Who are you?" "Ha!" The wizard was slightly stunned. He glanced at Amandina and suddenly threw the gemstone over as if it was a worthless stone. He then sternly said to Amandina, "You, pick it up." Amandina silently looked at the gemstone that rolled to her feet. Then she raised her head and looked at the bruised and swollen princess. "Let go of my maid first. I have the right to ask you to do so." "Interesting." The wizard snorted. He gestured to the black-armored knight, and the latter immediately let go of Griffin. The half-fairy princess knelt on the ground. She held her chest with tears in her eyes, and there was a purple mark on her neck. She could hardly speak and could only gasp for breath. Amandina couldn't bear to look at the princess. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly bent down and picked up the gem. "Amandina, don't." Princess Griffin was anxious. She could not speak and could only desperately signal to Amandina with her eyes. These people were extremely cold and ruthless. If they found out that Amandina was deceiving them, she was afraid that they would tear her to pieces in an instant. Right now, they did not know whether Miss Freya was alive or dead. If Amandina died here, she did not know how to explain it to Brando. But it was at this time that the princess suddenly froze. In everyone's eyes, the flawlessly cut golden gemstone was slowly burning in Amandina's hand. The center of the gemstone seemed to light up with a flame that slowly expanded outwards. Finally, it became bright and flawless, emitting a soft light in all directions. How beautiful! The magus couldn't help but praise when he saw this scene. Then he bent down and bowed to Amandina. "Then, Your Highness, I will have to trouble you to come with us. This golden gemstone. You may take it, the wizard replied politely, his previous arrogance gone. This is the end of its usefulness to us. With that, the magus turned around and ordered all the black-armored knights in the forest, clean up the battlefield and leave this place. Take away all the people who are still alive. Don't forget about the young lady and her sword. He pointed to Freya and the lionheart on the ground. Amandina held the golden gemstone in her hand and silently watched this scene. Her gaze slowly moved to Princess Griffin, but saw that the half-elf girl was staring at her blankly. Her silver eyes were full of pity and helplessness. Waking up from all the darkness, ignorance, and chaos was often the dream of mortals. When Griffin opened her eyes due to exhaustion, all she saw was darkness. The tent blocked the misty forest's bright night sky and the twinkling stars. Outside the tent, the sound of insects' wings could be heard. Creak, 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 like a nocturne. The sound of a woman's scream and cry came from the camp in the distance. The princess' heart could not help but tighten. She seemed to have entered another nightmare, but the latter was more realistic, like a knife cutting open her heart. She could hear her heart thumping loudly in her chest. This was proof that she was still alive. She was afraid that she would recognize Amandina's cries, but fortunately, as an important captive, Amandina was currently being carefully protected. With that in mind, Princess Griffin ignored the pain in her body and got up from the ground. As the princess's maid, she was given special treatment. The rebels had prepared a blanket for her and Freya, but that was all. Chapter 1459. In the darkness, Griffin saw the unconscious Freya. She crawled over and nudged the body of the girl from Butchie, whispering her name. But Freya's body was wrapped in thick bandages, which were the handiwork of a woman from a nearby town. This was also the minimum care that the wizards had given them according to Amandina's request. Griffin felt that Freya's breathing was very weak and intermittent. She used her cold hand to touch the knight's forehead, which was boiling hot. Her wound was festering and inflamed. The long and narrow sword wound was close to the lung and the heart. Griffin's knowledge of natural history and medicine, which she had gained from her royal education, told her that such a wound infection was likely to kill the Valkyrie. This discovery made Griffin anxious. She held Freya's hand tightly. The knight needed a qualified priestess, or at least a priest who could cast healing spells to stabilize her injury. But the people outside might not care about their lives, and the soldiers in the camp were different from the learned wizards. These private soldiers of the nobles who had not received much education were potential dangers. The wizard who brought them here had warned her not to leave her tent as much as possible, or else she would have to bear the consequences. In the darkness, Griffin finally remembered something. Her hand moved down her neck inch by inch, and finally, she touched the pendant of the necklace at her collarbone. Perhaps it was out of confidence, or perhaps it was because they did not care about this maid at all. The wizards did not search her body. They only took away her and Freya's weapons, including the Lionheart sword. Griffin's heart seemed to calm down. The necklace was her birthday gift. Her father had solemnly given it to her on her 7th birthday. This necklace could save her life in a critical moment. Every member of the royal family had something similar. Peruz had a set of rings with this necklace. It was also the proof of the two siblings. Griffin carefully took the necklace out from under her clothes, held the shiny pendant in her hand, and placed it on Freya's chest. But at this time, a strong wind seemed to have appeared in the forest, and the tent was rustling. Then, there was a chaotic sound of people and horses neighing from the camp, and the noise quickly became one. Griffin was shocked and stopped what she was doing. She looked up in the direction of the camp, and the light from the camp seemed to have become brighter, and the sky seemed to be burning. The noise quickly turned into the sound of fighting. The princess immediately understood that the camp had been attacked, but she was still not sure if the attackers were her allies. But the chaos in front of her made Griffin's heart skip a beat. She sensed that this might be an opportunity. But before she could act, there was a sudden sound of disorderly footsteps in the distance, and the sound quickly approached. There was a shout outside the tent, followed by angry scolding, and then the sound of swords clashing, fighting, short screams, and finally the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. Griffin's heart was in her mouth for a moment. She was not an ignorant little girl, and of course, she knew what was going on outside. At this time, there was a soft sound, and the tent was opened by a dirty noble swordsman. The man with a fierce face saw the scene in the tent and could not help but whistle. "Oh, there are two beautiful little doe here." Griffin's heart sank when she saw the other party's outfit, but she stood up and asked in a low voice, "Who are you?" "Ha!" The noble swordsman looked at Griffin's body with a greedy gaze. "Who do you think you are, little girl, the Princess of Erewhon?" After that, he reached out and grabbed Griffin's shoulder, and was about to press her to the ground. Princess Griffin almost forgot to resist due to her shock and anger. With a tearing sound, she felt a cold sensation on her chest. In that instant, the instincts that she had trained for 10 years returned to her body. The princess arched her body like a vigorous leopard, lifting her leg to knee the disgusting man in the crotch. The man let out a low cry from the depths of his throat, and in pain and anger, he wanted to choke Griffin's neck, but the half-elf girl nimbly took a step back, one hand blocking the wound on her chest, the other hand reaching out to grab the hilt of the sword at the man's waist. She pressed down with her thumb and pulled out the sword. The noble swordsman did not even have time to react. He instinctively lunged forward, but Princess Griffin had already stabbed him in the chest with her sword. The man let out a hoarse wail and looked at her unwillingly before falling heavily to the ground. The fight in the tent finally attracted the attention of the outside, and the rebel soldiers outside rushed in, cursing, but Griffin had completely calmed down. She swung her sword to cut down the spears that were coming in from the outside. Then, she stabbed 2 soldiers in succession. It was only then that the soldiers outside realized that they had not provoked a defenseless doe, but a female leopard that was baring her claws and fangs to hunt. Finally, after losing 2 more of their comrades, the disorganized noble private soldiers could not take it anymore. When the first noble private soldier faced Griffin, he turned around and fled, and the reaction spread like the plague. In an instant, the rebel soldiers had all fled. At that moment, Griffin finally could not take it anymore. She looked at the corpses on the ground, and a sense of humiliation and pain welled up in her heart at the same time, causing her to kneel on the ground. This was almost the first time she had personally killed someone, and the blood that stained the ground made her feel nauseous, but she did not know what to do. After killing so many people, those people would not let her go. She sat for a long time until the surroundings became quiet again, but after a while, Griffin seemed to have woken up from her blank state. She seemed to feel that the surroundings were a little cold, and she shivered as she crawled to Freya, picked up the female knight, and opened the pendant, which was a sparkling crystal bottle. The crystal bottle was filled with blood-red liquid. Griffin removed the glass stopper and poured a small part of the blood on Freya's chest. Then she pried open the female knight's pale lips and poured some of the blood-red liquid inside. Unfortunately, it did not help, and the liquid soon overflowed from the female knight's mouth and slid down the corner of her mouth. Griffin hesitated for a moment, but she suddenly raised the bottle and drank the liquid inside in one gulp. Then she held Freya's face with her hands and resolutely kissed her lips. In the darkness, Griffin shyly stuck out her tongue and passed the liquid in her mouth little by little. The 2 girls' tongues unconsciously intertwined with each other, and such an action made Griffin's cheeks burn. After a while, she heard the female knight moan in a low voice. Griffin jumped up like a frightened deer. She took a few breaths and turned her head. In the dim light outside, her cheeks were fiery red. Although the other party was just a girl, such a bold action was still somewhat beyond the limit of her imagination. She touched her face and was stunned for a while before she realized something. She hurriedly looked outside, and except for the scattered spears around the tent, there was no one. There were 2 corpses in the distance, and they had been dead for a long time. At this time, Griffin confirmed that something had indeed happened in the direction of the camp. It seemed that some of the noble's private soldiers had escaped during the chaos. After confirming this, she hurriedly retreated into the tent, picked up the somewhat heavy female knight, and then dragged her back with difficulty. The 2 quickly came to the back of the tent, which was also empty. Obviously, it was their best opportunity to escape. But when Griffin carried her female knight, she subconsciously looked back at the center of the camp, where the flames were soaring and shadows were flickering. She did not know how Amandina was doing now, who the attackers were, would they save Amandina? But she recalled the moment when Amandina stood up and looked at her with a gentle gaze, and her heart could not help but waver. Griffin almost swayed, but she gritted her teeth and quickly ran towards the forest not far away. Although the camp was in chaos, there would definitely be wizards who would notice here. She had to get into the forest before that, and it would be best if she could escape far away. But things were not as perfect as she had imagined. She had just run a few steps when there was an angry shout behind her, and a bright light rose from the darkness and shot from that direction. The sound of arrows piercing through the air came from behind, and the arrows almost grazed the princess' cheek as they flew past, and some even sank into the bushes. Griffin gritted her teeth and threw herself into the briar bush. The thorns scraped her cheeks and burned with pain, but she carefully protected the unconscious Freya, then got up and ran forward again. But it was at this time that the sound of a spell was heard. It was magic. The half-elf girl only felt a wave of despair in her heart. It was an attack that she absolutely could not avoid. Am I going to die here? She could not help but shout in her heart, Your Majesty, Father. But as if answering her question, a silver light suddenly shot from the front. Before Griffin could react, the sharp whistle passed by her and shot towards the wizard behind her. With a scream, the wizard turned over and fell to the ground. At the same time, a silver figure came to Griffin's side, one in each hand, and lifted her and Freya onto the back of a horse. Lady Brunhilde. When Griffin saw the horse king wrapped in silver flames, she immediately knew who had saved her. Brunhilde nodded and replied with a somewhat hollow voice, My sisters and I felt the disturbance in the direction of Castle Grey, so we rushed over, but we did not expect to be a step too late. Fortunately, you and Freya escaped, Your Highness. So it was really you who attacked the camp, Lady Brunhilde. Griffin said anxiously, Miss Amandina is still in the hands of those people, please be sure to save her. We will, Brunhilde replied, but the possibility is very small. The opponent is very strong, and there is a wizard who is even stronger than me. Fortunately, we are all spirits, and the wizards of the law cannot do anything to us. Griffin was completely stunned. A wizard who is stronger than Lady Brunhilde, isn't that a supreme being? But how did Erwin have a supreme being? And from the sound of it, none of the wizards were weak, or else a supreme being would not be able to stop the Valkyrie riders from saving people from the camp. Who are they? Griffin could not help but murmur. They are most likely Bugges, Your Highness, Brunhilde replied calmly, they are the Grey Wizards and the Law of the Mystic Realm, a branch of the Cisaldian. Griffin did not understand what a Grey Wizard was, and what a Cisaldian was, but she understood the Bugges. She could not help but widen her beautiful silver eyes, and said in surprise, Bugges, but why would the Bugges attack Erwin? To this question, Brunhilde could not answer. She quickly brought Griffin and Freya out of the enemy's pursuit range, and before that, she had already blown the trombone, calling for the Valkyrie riders to regroup. The Windrider colt landed in a clearing in the forest, and the lady gently put down the princess, then put down Freya, and asked, before the lord left, he told me and my sisters to listen to you and Freya's commands. What should we do now, Your Highness? Griffin took a step back in exhaustion, smoothing out her silver hair that was messed up by the wind, and subconsciously looked at Freya. The effect of the elixir of life had begun to take effect, and the female knight slowly blinked, as if she was waking up. Freya felt that she had a strange dream. She dreamed that she was seriously injured in a battle and was about to die. Brando hugged her in his arms, and even kissed her. The dream was so real that she almost did not want to wake up. But when she woke up, the first thing she saw was Brunhilde and her blazing Valkyrie, and then the princess beside her. "Your Highness," she called out weakly. Memories flowed back to her like water, and the female knight struggled to get up, and looked around. Where is everyone? Where is Amandine? Where is this place? This is a safe place, Brunhilde answered. Amandine was taken away by those people, and those wizards mistook her for me. Griffin walked over to support Freya, and explained the whole story in detail. They want to take Amandine to Kirkle Castle, and if her identity is exposed, her life will be in danger. How can this be? Freya was anxious. We have to save Amandine. She has been following the Lord since Bragg's. We cannot lose her. I will definitely save Amandine, Griffin replied. Freya, I promise you. But those are the Bugges. Why would they make an enemy out of us? We have to return to Valhalla immediately. Griffin took a deep breath, and since she knew that the enemy was the descendants of the Silver Knights, she had completely understood the situation at hand. Only Valhalla has the power to save Amandine. Chapter 1460. Heinf and Roland sat on two separate beds, looking at each other in silence. It was a small wooden hut, but it was still comfortable. The interior was clean and tidy, even carpeted. There were woolen paintings hanging on the walls, depicting abstract scenes of Mount Greyhar. The workers had planted lilies of the valley on the windowsill. These tiny white flowers poked out from the windowsill, swaying gently in the night breeze. These little flowers that were rarely seen in this season were nothing special in the Black Forest. In the loop of trade winds, as long as the long winter in the forest had yet to arrive, all kinds of flowers could be seen throughout the year. Heinf looked out of the window. A stream of light gathered in the darkness far away, like stars falling on the ground, giving people some warmth in the endless darkness. It was the light of the town. The locals called this new town Sarnan, which meant gem of light, to describe its scene in the night. The town was prosperous because of the mining industry. People from all over the world came here and settled down, forming the scale it was today. But now, there were no longer only refugees here. There were also gold miners and merchants who were attracted here. A market had formed spontaneously in the densely populated settlement. Surrounding Salnan, there were small villages in the dark forest. Perhaps in less than 10 years, this place would become another Ferber. However, the ones who restrained this place were still the Druids of the Kalanga Mountains. The Druids protected the fire seed, and at the same time, restrained the humans from overexploiting the forest. That guy, where is that wizard planning to take us? After a moment of silence, Roland could not help but ask, we are nobles. Even if we have offended him, there is no reason to restrict our freedom like this. Besides, what use are we to him? Does he want ransom? That's not a problem, but he has to send someone to deliver the message. Heinf turned around and said, you are the only captive, Roland. I am not. I volunteered to travel with this Lord Magus, as I happen to be heading towards Trondheim as well. Can't you see, Heinf? He is taking us in circles in the forest. I have spent weeks trekking in the Black Forest, but the journey from Marlith to Abbey's castle will take no more than 3 days. Roland said unhappily. Hein Fu looked at the young man mockingly. This fellow had always been arrogant, and he had finally learned his lesson this time. He took out a drawing board and a charcoal pencil from his backpack and began to scribble in front of the beautiful night view of Salnan. At the same time, he replied, it's up to the Lord. Besides, I don't think this is a waste of time. We saved a beautiful lady, didn't we? From the hands of your evil companions. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have taken so long. Besides, Roland, I'm afraid you're the one who doesn't know what's going on. Our noble identities aren't even worth mentioning in the eyes of that lord. I think you should be careful. You're standing against the princess this time, and I think that person is very concerned about the princess. He might be a member of the royal family of Covardo. Nonsense. Roland frowned. It's just a guess, but since when did Owen have such a powerful wizard? The Buga people don't seem to be worth mentioning in front of him. He was clearly concerned about the princess, and I think that's why those grey mages angered him. If the royal family has such a powerful backer, why would they need the count's help? Roland replied in a low voice. The charcoal pencil in Hein Fu's hand stopped. This was what he was worried about. His family relied on the rise of Erwin's royal power, but he himself was an admirer of the count. Everyone had their own ambitions, and from his standpoint, Hein Fu wanted to see the two become one. But if the royal family and the count had the same power, where would Erwin go in the future? He silently sketched out the image of the princess in his heart, but he found that there was no fixed shape. Between reality and ideal, which direction would the daughter of Oberg VII choose? This is the city that the count built himself, Hein Fu said. He is the last knight to open up a new territory for Wone since the age of pioneers. But I heard the nobles in various regions discussing this matter, and all of them were waiting to see a good show. As for the lower ranks of Erwin, they were indifferent, as if it had nothing to do with them. Few people can see the changes the dark forest has brought to Tonajol. This nameless southern border is now one of the most prosperous areas after Ampere Seal. The merchants are more sensitive to this. They have followed the count's footsteps into the dark forest. But most people, including these people, think that the count is lucky, but a person's luck is limited. Just like an investment, it can make money, but it can also lose money. But if those people were here today, they might be speechless about their own thoughts. He turned around and said, Roland, why do you think the nobles of Erwin today have such a different vision from the count? Roland was silent. He worshipped the count because of his outstanding martial arts and military prowess, as well as his powerful strength and legendary personal experience. All of these made the blood of the young people of this era boil. But more importantly, he was neither servile nor overbearing in front of crews. He was completely in line with the image of a hero in the hearts of the young people of Erwin. But no one was perfect, and the same was true for heroes. The count's legendary rise was due to his good luck in the dark forest. This was understandable, and there was a sense of mystery that was predestined. Perhaps it was Lady Martha who sent this hero to Erwin to save this ancient and fallen kingdom. This feeling of destiny was more in line with the noble's aesthetic. But today, all of his previous views had been overturned. A local merchant had personally done the math for them. It was Salnan's profit and investment in maintaining the Pyro Company within a single season. These were two astronomical figures that were equally unimaginable. It was an inconceivable plan in the eyes of the nobles. To them, most of the wealth that the count had plundered from the dark forest had been reinvested into the maintenance of his territory. It was simply a laughable arithmetic problem. But in fact, Roland saw the scattered towns in the dark forest taking root in the forest step by step. They were like giant trees that were sprouting, absorbing nutrients from the ground and feeding back to the land. And one day, this place would become Erwin's territory. Since the pioneer era, this was the slimmest hope in the darkness, but it was so real here. At that moment, Roland truly felt a great sense of mission that breathed in the future and destiny of a common future. It was a long-term vision that made one's soul tremble. It would take decades, or even hundreds of years, a generation, or even several generations of effort to complete all of this. A long-term plan about the future of the kingdom, and even the future of civilization and order of the world. It was just a small step in Tonajol, but it was like opening the door to a vast world for people. The infighting of the people of Erwin in the small land, and even the conflicts in the entire wound, were extremely laughable behind this door. Roland seemed to have gotten to know Heinf all over again. Heinf, I didn't expect you to care about this too. It's not profound. It's just that some people don't want to understand it. Heinf used a charcoal pencil to draw a long ridge on a piece of paper as he replied. Since you have seen all of this, Roland replied in a deep voice, I believe you have the intention to change it, and this is exactly what we are doing. After the Count left, Her Highness did all kinds of things to erode the strongest power in the kingdom. If Tonagel falls apart because of this, everything that we have seen in the dark forest will one day become a bubble. He paused for a moment. If you are still bothered by what happened before, I can apologize to you for it. Heinf, I think we have the same ideals. Why don't you join the royal faction with me? Heinf turned around and looked at him mockingly. Do you really think the royal faction can change Erwin, Roland? The royal faction only hopes to turn Erwin back into the Erwin of the past. They are immersed in the so-called prosperous period before the War of Frost, where the royal family and nobles ruled together. But in that so-called best era, how much has Erwin changed? It hasn't changed, Heinf replied. Because the nobles actually don't want to change. They just want to maintain the status quo. In that era, we had outstanding figures like Sword Saint Darius and Tolman. But in fact, the so-called resurgence is only because of people and also because of people. Roland, it's the same today. In Erwin where the nobles rule, Tonagel's miracle is only a flash in the pan. The lessons of Lord Tolman and Lord Darius have been deliberately ignored by some people. Preposterous. Nonsense. The young man frowned. He was struggling in his heart. It was as if there was a voice in his head telling him that Heinf's words were correct. But everything he saw and heard since he was young, his class, his family, and his birth made him have a good impression of Erwin. You know very well, Roland. The Count has already given us the answer. Chapter 1461. Let the kingdom inherit the Count's dream. This dream will be the whole of Erwin, not Tonagel, or any other noble's territory. You should understand the short-sightedness of those people. Only the kingdom's vision is long-term. We can't expect everyone to be like the Count, but everyone in Erwin understands the meaning of strength and dignity. Roland's eyes were filled with disbelief. He had never heard of such a thing before, and it made him feel as if he was meeting the brother of a classmate he used to look down on for the first time. He subconsciously fell silent. But the Count is no longer here. It doesn't matter, but his will is still there, and we still have His Highness. I believe Prince Haruz must understand the Count's ambition. What do you want to do? The royal faction is a thing of the past, but Erwin does need a new belief. Roland, we have like-minded people, why should we wallow in the mire with the past? Hans's eyes flashed with a bright light, as if there was a flame in them. The light of the stars in the sky shone on the dark forest. The darkness seemed to allow Brando's perception to expand in all directions. The eye of the heart watched the entire forest. The fallen leaves, the insects, the light flapping of the owl's wings, the whispers, and any small details in the dark corners were all reflected in his heart. He stopped and stood in the middle of the forest, as if he was a part of this silent nature. Although he was seriously injured and almost lost his life in the battle with Akentu in the realm of stagnation, but ever since Martha healed his injuries and returned to Wound, he felt that he was getting closer to the laws of this world. His strength seemed to be growing every moment, and he was getting closer and closer to the checkpoint he was once familiar with. Is my lord in a bad mood? Scarlet also stopped and said with a little guilt, is it because we wasted too much time in the loop of trade winds? She lowered her head, if I hadn't been too careless and provoked those bugas, it's nothing. Sausalds deserved it. Brando shook his head. His thoughts were not on this matter. He naturally heard the conversation in the wooden house in the distance. It seemed that his influence on Erwin was growing larger and larger, but whether it was good or bad, it was hard to say. However, he had no intention of stopping them. Of course, Erwin didn't just need a single person. This ancient kingdom still had its future and its next generation. At the very least, these people had already developed different ideas from their parents. It was like a pool of stagnant water that was rippling with new ripples. Chien. Brando suddenly said. Can I invite my guard captain to walk with me? The mountain maiden was stunned. Sir, aren't we walking? Of course not, Brando replied. Although I'm inviting my captain of the guards, I'm taking up her rest time. You can't keep this face all the time, right? Chien showed a puzzled look. Brando smiled and stretched out his hand. Come to my side, don't always follow behind me. Do I look scary? Chien stared blankly at Brando's outstretched hand. She hesitated for a while before putting her hand on it. When Brando held her hand, the girl's movements were obviously stiff, but soon, she softened. Brando looked at Chien's awkward walking movements and couldn't help but find it funny. Is my captain of the guards actually a puppet? Under the bright moonlight, Chien seemed to have lost the ability to speak. She lowered her head and said nothing. Brando smiled and shook his head, but his thoughts were a little unpredictable. He had been dreaming a lot these days. He dreamed of the past, of the night in Bucci, of the Roman, and also of his senior sister and the princess. He dreamed of fighting and escaping in the darkness. The dreams were grotesque and variegated. Some were real, some were absurd. In every dream, there seemed to be someone trying to talk to him, telling him everything about the past and the future. He couldn't help but think of the Cisaldian alliance. Those wizards had been secretly imprisoned, but they went missing in the loop of trade winds. It might be a little troublesome for the Cisaldians to investigate. Therefore, he handed those people over to the Druids. The power of the loop of the world was not inferior to the Silver Alliance. The Druids owed him a favor for the loop of trade winds, and the two had always cooperated well. This small matter was not worth mentioning. He interrogated those people and found out a lot of things. The Cisaldians coveted the war slate. This was not surprising. After all, they were once the owners of this taboo knowledge. There were some ambitious people who wanted to use this to restore the former status of the Silver Folk, recreate the empire in the sky, and let the Bugas have the silver blood flowing again. Since the change of the law of Tiamat and the fall in status, such arrogant ideas had become more and more marketable within the Silver Alliance. He heard that the Bugas had hurriedly withdrawn from the wild conference of the Four Realms. There must have been internal disagreements and different voices. Vladimir the Great and Wizard Cisaldian had been splitting up the Silver Federation, and now was the best opportunity for them. This was originally an internal matter of the Silver Folk, but the Cisaldians reached out to Erwin, which made Brando feel a sense of danger. The hostility shown by the Grey Mages towards Princess Griffine was obviously not as simple as seizing the slate. He saw such a future in the dream. He did not know whether the future was real or not, but it confused him. He subconsciously stretched out his hand, as if trying to grasp the world. The moonlight passed through his fingers, making it look a little hazy. The forest in the distance was still immersed in darkness, but it was not difficult to see the undulating shadows of the Greyhill Mountains. There was a sparkling stream through the forest, making the pebbles glow brightly in the moonlight. A few fawns were flashing through the forest. Out of Sarnan, he set foot on the land of the Abes. This trade route in the Black Forest could be said to have been opened by him, but walking on this road, he had a strange sense of homesickness. Where was his hometown? Tonagel, Braggs, or Bucci, was it the past or the present? Scarlet, what do you think the world is like? Brando suddenly stopped and turned back to ask. This question was a little too big. The Highlander girl was silent for a moment, then shook her head silently. Brando smiled. He actually did not expect to get the answer, or rather, he already got the answer. The world and people's hearts had different meanings in people's hearts. It became bright or dark according to people's hearts. For different people, there was no fixed answer. What kind of world did he want? Brando silently thought about the answer to this question. But the same question seemed to have triggered some thoughts in the Highlander girl's heart. Brando suddenly felt a pair of hands hugging him from behind. He felt Scarlett's nervous heartbeat, which was tightly pressed against his back, as if there was no distance between them, and transmitted to his heart. "What's wrong, Scarlett?" Scarlett did not say a word. "Are you afraid? I heard from the elders that the gods will become the stars in the sky, shining on their people on the ground. I'm afraid that one day, the Lord will also leave us." Brendel could not help but laugh out loud when he heard that. He laughed so hard that tears came out of his eyes. This silly girl, he held Scarlett's hands in front of his chest. What gods? We're just mortals. Scarlett did not say a word. Brando suddenly stopped laughing. He felt an endless amount of power pouring into his body. Every breath he took seemed to echo with the mountains, and the rustling of the pine trees turned into a wave. It was like the sound of his heartbeat. Heaven and earth, at this moment, became one with him. Brando closed his eyes and felt a slight resonance in his heart. He felt as if his blood was echoing with the sound of metal and stone hammering, and the rumbling was the echo of the silver lines of the law. The laws formed his body, and the magic formed his blood. When he opened his eyes, it was like the first rays of dawn. When he closed his eyes, it was like the bright moon in the sky. When he exhaled, it was like the biting cold northern wind. When he spoke, his words turned into laws and symbols. With every step he took, life was born from his footprints. When his heart beat, it became one with the pulse of the earth. Brando sighed. At that moment, he saw the end of the sage's journey. There, Martha seemed to be waiting for him in the light. "I won't leave you," he whispered to Scarlett, "I swear." He was very close to home now. Beyond this forest was the wilderness of Abes. The moonlight of the Black Forest must have shone on that land as well. Early morning. Green Village was located at the border between the Black Forest and the Green Village. Ever since Abes opened a new passage to the Black Forest from Schaflund, this place became deserted. Few people passed by the ruins of the forest. Only adventurers would pass by or stay here for a short while. The broken walls in the forest were evidence of the decline of this place. In the east of the village, the Tonajal people built a watchtower. Sentinel Hard stood at the top of the tower. The forest a few miles away was within his field of vision, and he was surprised to see a group of people coming from the direction of Green Village. The captain was boiling tea in a kettle with a frown. The news from the north was getting more and more intense. It was said that the White Lion Guards had already fought with the rebels, but the news was very tight. One moment it was said that the rebels had already reached Vladipes, and the next moment it was said that the rebels had already reached Fort Palace. But no matter which side it was, the news was mostly bad. At least the army from the north had already taken Ampere Seal. This was true news. Even the sea transport was intermittent, and the number of merchants coming to Abes had decreased significantly. Chapter 1462. It was said that this was related to the changes in the Cruz Empire. Since the fall of the Black Moon, trade had begun to decline substantially. But fortunately, with the help of the Nagas, at least the route to Atlanta and Nazir was still open. But this was not good news. The army of Abes had already left for the north, and according to the letter from home, Menta and Old had begun to evacuate south, crossing the Gus River. Now the refugees were gathering in Abes, and some were gathering in Gree. The harsh winter had not passed, and it was as if they had returned to the time before the year of flowers and summer leaves. Every time this happened, the captain could not help but miss the time when the Lord was still in the territory. Recently, rumors about Princess Amandina and Amandina began to circulate in the fief, vividly describing how the two women had usurped the count's position. Although the captain thought it was ridiculous, everyone could see that Amandina was loyal to the count. But he also felt that since the Lord left, Tanagel's days had indeed become harder and harder. This might be related to the turmoil in the south, but it made it difficult for people to trust the princess' ability. These days made him feel anxious. Although the struggle for power between the nobles and the royal family had nothing to do with them, the bottom of the Erewhon, no Tanagel was willing to return to the past. "Captain, I heard that the army in the north is full of monsters." The youngest sentry in the sentry tower stared at the dark red flame in the darkness, and there seemed to be a ball of fire in his dark eyes. He looked at the gurgling lid of the teapot and suddenly said, "Don't talk nonsense, where did the monsters come from?" "I heard it from a merchant, he came from the north. He heard that the nobles in the north colluded with the monsters and killed the king's eldest son. Otherwise, why would they fight here? The king's eldest son has already made peace with us." The captain glared at him. Nonsense. However, he also felt uneasy. It seemed that there had indeed been a massacre in Ampere-Seal. Many of the merchants who had come from the north to seek refuge here were in a state of panic. Some of them vividly described the tragic scene of the battle. However, such rumors also increased the tension in Tanagel. The sentinel added a branch to the stove, and a spark burst out from the flames. He then asked, "Captain, do you think Maynard can win?" "Of course, what nonsense are you talking about?" The captain replied snappily, "We have the White Lion Guards, the subterranean dwellers, and the Buga fleet. Who in Aween is our match? But no one is sure." "Have you heard, Captain?" "I heard that the rebels have the support of the Bugas. The Bugas are also divided into many groups. Didn't Lady Maynard say that the ones involved in the rebellion are only a small part of them? By the time the rest of the Bugas react, they'll be finished. What if we lose before the other Bugas realize what's going on? Why do you have so much crap to say?" The captain gave him a knock on the head. "If we lose, we lose. The sky won't fall. Besides, the Lord hasn't returned yet. When the Lord comes back, these guys will be nothing." The sentinel cried out and hurriedly covered his head. However, the captain's words made the tower quiet for a moment. Everyone stopped talking and looked in their direction. Yes, the Lord hasn't returned yet. But he will definitely come back. Everyone in Tanagel still remembered the miracle of Lord Paulus, and how he turned the tide in Ampere-Seal. He was a man who made the impossible possible, and any difficulties seemed to be easy in front of him. It was a kind of blind confidence. A crackling sound suddenly came from the top of the building. Everyone looked up and saw Hadrian rolling down the stairs and into the pile of firewood below. Captain, there's someone." "Who is it?" The captain stood up almost instantly. He lifted the teapot and poured the tea onto the fire. Sparks flew and smoke rose into the air. The people outside immediately closed the door. A few sentinels had already taken their crossbows from the shelf. Yes, yes, yes. Hadrian's face was red as he gestured wildly. F***CKU, calm down. Isn't it just an enemy attack? The captain kicked him. Tell me clearly, is it the rebel army's henchmen? If it is, we'll go and F***CK their asses up. No, no, no. Hadrian scrambled to his feet and gestured. Yes, 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 yes. It's my lord. What? The captain almost thought that he had misheard. But at this moment, the door outside was knocked open with a bang. It was the sentinel outside who came in. Both of them looked like they had seen a ghost. Behind them, a lady with a long ponytail and a halberd in her hand walked in. Allium Japonicum silently looked at Menta on the other side of the Gree River. Snow began to fall sporadically from the sky. This winter's snow had come late enough, and she could almost foresee the drought and insect infestation next year. Fortunately, Tonajul had the druids and their acolytes, so it was slightly better. But in other regions, life was not so good. The winter rain and snow were bone-chilling, but she only wore a shawl over her armor. She even refused the fur vest. The troops from ABs were crossing the ferry, but there were only a few of them. The main force was the 3rd platoon of the White Lion Guard stationed in Gars. Do you really not need to bring the subterranean dwellers and the fleet? Before Miss Amandina left, she told me that if necessary, I can give you a portion of Valhalla's power. Monique said from beside her. Allium Japonicum shook her head. This is only to cover Menta's retreat. We're not going to fight the traitors. Then, what is the best time? At least until we know who our opponents are. It's not just the Bugis. Allium Japonicum nodded. In the past month, news of the disaster of White Mountain had spread like a plague across the continent. News of the Bugis withdrawing from the wilderness of 4 realms shook the entire world, and the conflict between the undead and the wind elves intensified. However, Erwin's people did not have the time to care about these things that were still far away from them. The eldest son of the king, Levon Renesson, went missing near Pelican Castle, and almost overnight, it caused unease among the northern nobles. But before they could express their protest, a mysterious army that originated from Yenbao had already moved south. In just half a month, it had conquered Covardo, Grey Mountain, and Cipher, and besieged Erwin's navy and the White Lion Legion in Yanilasu and Balta respectively. By the middle of the month of slumber, this army had already arrived at the city of Ampere Seal. And it was at this time that no one would have thought that the Grey Mages of the Sassalds would publicly break the sacred covenant and intervene in the civil war of the mortal kingdoms. And so, with the Bugis pushing behind the scenes, Randner's civil war broke out. Transportation and communications between Lantanailan, Randner, and Silman were completely cut off, and Ampere Seal and Frauda, which had lost their rear, were declared lost one after another. Her Royal Highness and the little prince had lost contact, and there was no news of them at all. The first column of the White Lion Legion had loyally completed their duties in Ampere Seal, while the second column was blocked in Cipher on the other side of Frauda, and the Royal Knight Regiment had suffered a crushing defeat in Frauda. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, Allium Japonicum found herself facing all this alone and without help. The last news she received was about the fact that the mysterious army's vanguard had crossed Frauda Pass and was heading straight for the northern fortress of Tonajul, Palace. Allium Japonicum understood that the fall of Palace was only a matter of time, and Brando had never set up a real defense in that direction. The only core of Tonajul's defense line was Valhalla. But was Valhalla really enough to rely on? As the army went south and merged with Randner's rebel army, Allium Japonicum gradually saw the outline of the whole incident. Although some people swore that the nobles in the north were in cahoots with the demons, others thought that it was a rebel army from the usurper of Yenbao, and there were even rumors about the intrigues of the Kurlutz people. But Allium Japonicum could already smell the scent of the Sassalds alliance behind the rebel army. History had begun to revert, and the Wizard War was coming as expected. But there was still a third party in this war, which did not match the history she knew. The key factor was Yenbao. The mysterious army that originated from Yenbao. In Allium Japonicum's memory of the dream, the only memory of Yenbao for her was the crystal forest. It was the crystal cluster. She felt that she had found the third party on this battlefield. The Sassalds had allied with the Twilight Dragon earlier than history. But why would they make such a big fuss over a mere Erwin? Allium Japonicum suddenly thought of the words that Freya had brought back from Brando, Sophie. Could it be that Erwin was hiding some secret? Otherwise, why would it be so unique? She still remembered the locals' description of the day of the Black Moon's fall. The pillar of light that shot into the sky caused Erwin to suffer the least damage in that disaster. If only Sophie was here. Allium Japonicum could not help but mutter. She did not know how she could win this war. Facing Lord Paulus was the Sausalds, the Infidels, the Twilight Dragon's minions, and the rebels in the south. It was a huge coalition that was almost impossible to defeat. Moreover, she still had to hope that the princess would be safe. You seem to be in a difficult position. Of course it is. Erwin's opponents were never set up for enemies of the level of the Sausalds, at least not now. We can use the slate that Miss Scarlet sent back. Mr. Tamar has temporarily lent it to me. It can deliver magic power that far exceeds the magic engine provided by Miss Amandina. I only need a little more time to complete the charging of the lower network. Monica replied, at that time, we may have more confidence. But the prerequisite is that Miss Maynard must protect yourself, because you are the only one with the highest authority in Valhalla. If you are not here, I can't command this fortress to fight. I will, Allium Japonicum replied, don't worry, this operation will be very safe. It will only cover for Mr. Reto and the others to retreat. To be honest, I don't want to use Valhalla's power for another reason. I am someone beside the princess, you should understand. I don't quite understand the thoughts of you humans. Monica shook her head, but I also support a defensive battle. This will consume much less of the world tree. Allium Japonicum nodded, I should be back in 3 days. Count Oberway has already confirmed the movements of the rebels. It should be enough to buy us 3 days. Even if there are any problems, I can retreat in advance. I hope so. Monica took out a gem the size of a human pinky from her pocket and handed it to the female knight with both hands, but you better take this with you. Life gem. Yes, if you encounter danger, I will find a way to get the wind archers or the subterranean dwellers to help you. Allium Japonicum nodded. She saw the last group of soldiers waiting across the river. She loosened the reins, clamped the horse's belly slightly, and let the warhorse under her start to move forward. She turned to Monica and said, good luck. Then wish us good luck, Monica. Monica nodded and watched the female knight rush into the rain. Chapter 1463. Snow fluttered on the ground, and soon a thin layer of snow accumulated outside the gates of Hades. The scattered white seemed to be washing away the filth of the old world, adding a touch of freshness to the kingdom. Then we'll say goodbye here, Hainf. Outside the gates of Coldshurt, Brando said, I'm really sorry for taking up so much of your time. It's nothing, my lord, this is also my own request. Hainf smiled carelessly, I just came out to relax, there's nothing particularly important. He looked at Ling and Lotus and waved to the 2 sisters, Ling, Lotus, take care of yourselves, I'll come to Lantern Island to see you when I have the chance. You too, Mr. Hainf. Lotus bowed in return. Ling was still expressionless and silent, his hands tightly holding the bag full of dried Dracaena moss. See you later, my lord. See you later. Hainf took one last look at Roland before turning and disappearing into the crowd. Roland bared his teeth and asked Brando, where are you going to take me, respected wizard? Your father is the Redbud Count. Wysick, the deputy commander of the Southern Legion. Brando glanced at him and asked. Yes. Then why did he send you to Tonajol? If I remember correctly, your family has a deep relationship with the royal faction. Didn't your father disagree with Princess Griffin's ideals? On the one hand, it's to learn. After all, the Count is famous in Erewhon. It can be foreseen that no matter who is in power in the future, there will be a place for Tonajol at the top of Erewhon. On the other hand, it's to obtain some information, mainly regarding Her Highness the Princess. My father wants to know the true relationship between Her Highness the eldest princess and the people of Trenheim. Roland replied without hesitation. However, after seeing Brando's interrogation methods, he did not expect to hide anything. He did not want to become an idiot like those Bugas. What do you think? There are rumors that Her Royal Highness will marry Count Tonajel Randner, but Her Royal Highness has never expressed her stance, and I heard that Count Randner already has a wife. Who did you hear that from? Brando interrupted him. The Count is a Highland knight and has been married since he was a child. He was already in his 40s when he participated in the Ampere Seal Peace Conference, so he should be married by now. I heard that the Count also has a daughter called Sifrid. What did you say? Brando almost choked. He thought to himself, what kind of ridiculous rumor is this? He turned around and saw that Lien's little face had turned red. Ling also looked at him with a strange look. What's wrong? Did I say something wrong? Noticing the strange expressions on everyone's faces, Roland could not help but stop. No, I didn't, Brando replied weakly. It's only been less than a week, and I'm already 10 years older. Gossips are really scary. But it seems like I do have a marriage arranged before I was born, but as for the person, go on. Roland continued, if Her Royal Highness does not intend to marry Count Tonajel, then she is undoubtedly too close to the Count's retainers. The strange thing is that the Count himself does not seem to mind and even agreed to the request of being an ambassador to the Empire. Is this your own judgment? That's what the nobles think. Brando thought to himself, these people sure have a rich imagination. Being nobles seems to be a waste of talent for them. Why don't I just let Her Royal Highness arrest them and force them to become screenwriters, novelists or something? That would save them from causing trouble all day long. Nonsense. Scarlet finally could not hold it in any more and sneered coldly. The Count's trip to cruise was obviously for her, but these schemers gave him an inexplicable reason. This is based on facts, ouch. Roland tried to defend himself, but before he could finish, he was hit by a halberd. Fortunately, Scarlet, kind-heartedly, used the handle of the halberd, or else his abdomen would have been split open. Brando looked sympathetically at the youth who was bent over like a shrimp on the ground. He shook his head and signaled Ropar to help him up. I'll give you 2 pieces of advice. First, don't reason with a lady, especially a beautiful lady who is stronger than you. Second, don't overcomplicate things. Sometimes, the simplest reason may be the truth of the matter. Brando finished and turned to walk towards Coldshurt Castle in the snow. What did you say, wizard? Roland did not hear clearly. He held his stomach and got up to ask. Brando did not answer his question. Instead, he looked at the streets of Abbey's castle. He had not been here for some time. Coldshurt Castle had expanded a lot, but the streets were somewhat desolate. Night patrols and soldiers could be seen everywhere. It was full of the aura of war. Before Brando entered the city, he had heard about the war in the north and the rebellion of the nobles. He was a little surprised by the latter. The action of the nobles was somewhat beyond his expectations. However, considering the shadow of the Sassalds behind them, it was not surprising. He asked about the army that came from the north, but not many people could explain it clearly. It was said that the army set afire in Ampere Seal, burning 1/3 of the port to the ground. This rumor made Brando's face darken. Those who were familiar with him might understand that Brando had already sentenced some people to death in his heart. It seemed that those people were still alive and kicking, but Scarlet knew that someone was about to be unlucky. Brando was more worried about what happened to Randner. He could only hope that the Duke of Grenoires would not go too far. If something happened to Her Highness, Amandina, and the others, then he would let these people know what a real disaster was. But in the end, this debt would be settled with the Sassalds. He did not blame his senior, Her Highness, and the others for their mistakes. After all, the Bugas were opponents of a different level. Erwin was far from having the ability to wrestle with them, even if he was prepared. But fortunately, he was back. In history, Vladimir the Great was still high-spirited for a period of time, but this time, Brando wanted to make him regret the choice he made. He slowly walked towards the direction of Cold Shirt Fortress, silently observing the mental state of the Tonajol people along the way. It seemed that the construction of the Roman lady was fruitful. Although the army was pressing on the border, there were no scenes of looting and panic. The people even seemed to have a common enemy. The owners of the shops cursed the invaders, and the civilians were also discussing the upcoming war, but most of them had confidence in Tonajol. This scene also deeply shocked Roland. He had never seen such civilians in any of Erewhon's regions. They were talking about their own fate and the fate of this territory, as if they were the masters here. They were full of pride towards Tonajol and their count. But at the same time, he also frowned because of Randner's rebellion. Brando saw his expression and could not help but feel strange. You don't look happy. Why would I be happy? Aren't you on the same side as these people? It's because I'm on the same side as these idiots that I have a headache. Her words made Brendel, who was brewing his anger, laugh involuntarily. Where did that come from? Violence is the worst principle in Erewhon's current situation, especially when they intend to involve Tonajol in the war. You're not so naive as to think that the conflict in Erewhon can be resolved peacefully, are you? The problem does not necessarily need to be resolved. My father told me that as long as the power of the royal family is restricted, Her Highness will have to maintain the current balance. What we need to do now is to not let the nobles in the north side of the Corvado family because of the eldest son of the king, so that we can obtain as many benefits as possible in the Second Ampere Seal Conference. Brando looked at the youth who was frowning and sighed. This is the reason why you formed an alliance with the Sausalts. Who are the Sausalts? A branch of the Buga people. Because the Buga people have designs on some things in Erewhon, they do not want to see the birth of a powerful Corvado dynasty, just like the setback they encountered in Cruz. Is this what your father told you? Roland nodded. You've been deceived. Of course, your father may be in the dark too, but at least he knows more than you. What do you mean? Can't you see that the Sausalts have ulterior motives? Everything they are doing now is to push Erewhon into the fire pit. Unfortunately, the nobles think that they are using each other, but they don't know that they are not qualified at all. Roland could not help but freeze in place. Brando did not speak anymore and continued to walk forward. The snow was getting heavier and heavier, and the eaves on both sides of the road were already snow-white. This world wrapped in silver seemed to be descending. Roland was stunned for a moment in the snow. Suddenly, a figure rushed out from the crowd and collided with him. He let out a muffled groan and fell backwards, caught off guard. That person also let out an ouch and tumbled. Roland was about to curse when he heard a shocked voice, Roland. Roland looked up and found that the person who had knocked him down was a handsome boy. Coincidentally, the other person was Haint's younger brother. Clin. Oh, Roland, you're back. That person got up and said excitedly, just in time, come with me, something big has happened. What? Roland frowned and looked at this pair of brothers who were haunting him. I heard that Count Tonajol has returned. Chapter 1464. What did you say? Roland was shocked. Like many others, he had only stayed in Tonajol for less than half a year. As the situation in the southern border became more and more tense, he listened to his father's orders and secretly returned to his family. Although it was said to be a secret, it was difficult to hide it from the people of Tonajol. Fortunately, Lady Amandina did not stop him. However, like many other young nobles, he came because of the Count's reputation, but he did not get the chance to see the legendary Count. He could not help but feel disappointed. Hearing Krillin say that Count Trenheim had actually returned to Cold Shirt at this time, Roland could not help but feel excited and uneasy. The uneasiness was naturally due to the fact that he and the Count were enemies and not friends. Once he thought of the Count's legendary experiences, the young man could not help but feel anxious. Moreover, the Count's freedom did not seem to be in his hands. Thinking of this, Roland subconsciously turned his gaze to Brando, who was not far away. Brando was also paying attention to the conversation. Krillin had naturally noticed the young man who was with Roland. He faintly felt that he was familiar, but he did not think much of it. Now that he saw Roland asking for his opinion, he could not help but be shocked. He thought that Brando was a descendant of one of the prominent families in the southern border, perhaps an illegitimate son of the Duke of Grenoires. "Who is he?" he asked softly. "A magus," Roland replied dryly, and then added, "very powerful." It was as if he was trying to justify his loss of freedom. However, Krillin did not think so. Roland's vague explanation only increased his suspicions. Besides, how could there be such a young magus who was very powerful? Did he really think that everyone in this world was like the Shire? Moreover, it was said that the Shire was in the state of a heroic spirit, which was why he looked so young. It was said that he was from the same era as Sword Saint Darius. However, he didn't question him rashly and only looked at the latter. He did not recognize Scarlet because Highlander girls rarely appeared in the territory, but the Silver Elf bloodline in Ling and Lotus shocked him. Most of the nobles sent to Tonajul were personally taught by Amandina, especially the younger generation. Clint was only 10 years old this year, and even though Roland was slightly older, he was only 15 years old. The education they received in Tonajul was often far beyond their peers. Amandina herself was knowledgeable, and most of her knowledge about Erwin came from Brando. Not only did she surpass Erwin in this era, but she also surpassed the knowledge and vision of most people in this era. In Erwin, there were almost no nobles who could truly differentiate the different branches of the Silver Elves, and there were also not many who knew that there were factions within Madara. It could be said that the youths who came from Tonajul were the most insightful and far-sighted people in Erwin in this era. Clint had studied in Tonajul for much longer than Roland, so he could recognize the Silver Elf characteristics on Ling and Lotus at a glance. He couldn't help but be amazed that there was a pair of beautiful Silver Elf descendants in Tonajul. At this time, Brando stopped Scarlet, who was about to ask questions, and at the same time, gave a look to the Grey Wolves mercenaries, and asked Albert to delay the Highlander girl. At the same time, he opened his mouth and asked, "The Count of Tonajul you mentioned is the famous Count?" "Yes, Mr. Wizard." "Then bring us to him." Brando's tone was almost indisputable, and the boy found himself unable to open his mouth to refute. He could only subconsciously look at Roland in confusion. "Bring him to him." Roland had long been familiar with the way the young wizard spoke, and he replied with a tone of despair. This wizard seemed easy to get along with, but when he got serious, he had the aura of a lord. He spoke as if thousands of soldiers and horses were bowing down to him. He had only seen such an aura from Duke Grenoires. He could not help but mutter to himself about Hank's unreliable deduction. Clint thought for a moment, and it seemed that there was no reason to object. Now that the enemy was in front of them, the Count had to meet the people of Coldshirt to calm them down. He believed that no one would dare to behave atrociously in front of the legendary figure. "Sir Roland, who allowed you to spread rumors in Coldshirt?" Yuta coldly stared at the middle-aged man in front of her. The lonely winter's sun passed through the skylight and formed a beam of light that fell on the dark hall of Castle Abes. The arched door leading to the courtyard was wide open, and the sunlight that fell on the ground was shockingly bright. The middle-aged man standing in front of Yuta had a thick beard above his lips. He was dressed in a neat suit, and there was a faint sneer on his face. "Madam Yuta, I did spread some news outside, but I'm afraid it's not all rumors, right? This is Tonajul, and there's no need for you to go beyond your authority." "What's wrong?" Roland pretended to be surprised and replied, "Even the Count's return to his territory is a secret that needs to be kept." "Ridiculous. How could the Lord come back at this time? Yuta suddenly realized that it was a secret and subconsciously closed her mouth. She looked at the other party with her emerald eyes and took a deep breath. Her towering breasts gently rose and fell, and then she replied, "In short, I hope you can abide by the rules that guests should abide by, or I'll have to send you out of the country." Oh, so the one who really has the right to speak in this land is no longer the Count of Tonajol. Has Madame Yuta decided to disobey your lord, or have you already colluded with that woman to have such an intention? Sir Roland, pay attention to your words. I'll report everything that happened here today to Count Corvado. Maybe you've drunk too much, I'll let you go out and sober up. Yuta didn't know what was wrong with this guy. In her memory, although this night was not very outstanding, at least he was a polite gentleman, but today he seemed to be as aggressive as a mad dog. She turned around and coldly shouted, "Guards!" At this time, the hall was slightly dark, and a figure blocked the sunlight at the door. It was a young man wearing a black trench coat, and there was a thick layer of snow on his woolen coat. Yuta's voice was stuck in her throat, my lord. Yuta, why are you so rude to the friends of the king's party?" the young man asked with a frown. Yuta felt every hair on her body stand up. That sharp metallic voice was definitely not the lord she was familiar with. She subconsciously took a step back and pulled out her long sword. There was a metallic sound in the air, and the bright light reflected on the wall. The tip of the sword shook slightly and pointed directly at the two people opposite her. Yuta held the sword that Brando gave her, and the leather gloves engraved with the black pine emblem rubbed the mithril hilt and guard. She shouted, "Guards, catch these two people." The young man did not seem to hear the sword in her hand. He touched his cheek with his hand. "Strange, don't I look like the Count of Tonajol?" Yuta could not bear it anymore. She growled and stabbed the sword, but she felt that her sword had pierced a layer of barrier and could not go any further. The young man raised his hand, and a sharp airflow swept across her abdomen. Yuta only felt that her vision turned black, and a tearing pain came from her lower abdomen. Her legs were weak, and she could not hold the sword in her hand. It fell to the ground with a clang, and she subconsciously knelt down. At that moment, the entire hall seemed to spin in front of her eyes. As the world spun, she felt herself falling to the ground. In her field of vision, a dazzling and eye-catching smear of blood was slowly spreading, like a flower blooming in the autumn forest. Pain and struggle were reflected in the female knight's eyes. She tried her best to get up and grab onto something, but her blood-stained fingers eventually stopped moving. Not far away, the sword that the Lord gave her was lying quietly on the ground. The sword was slender, and the blade was reflecting the cold winter sun. Rosebud looked indifferently at the female knight lying in a pool of blood. The young man beside him had turned in another direction. The guard who was rushing over with a halberd suddenly flew back and hit the long table. With a bang, the table and chair collapsed. It seemed that it was just a moment, and the hall immersed in darkness was quiet again. Sir Rosebud squatted down and used his finger to check Yuta's breath. "She's not dead yet. It doesn't matter. We still need her anyway." He stood up again and snapped his fingers. Several black knights in heavy armor came in from the outside and moved the unconscious female knight away from the pool of blood. The young man looked at Yuta's sword at his feet. He thought for a moment, stepped on it, and broke the blade in two. There was a soft sound. At the other end of the hall, someone seemed to have knocked down the candlestick. "Who is it?" Rosebud quickly looked in that direction and could only see the back of a black-haired girl. He knew the girl. She was a girl from Butchie named Sue. She was the daughter of Copper Dragon Reto and a guest of Abe's castle. "Catch her, don't let her leave Abe's castle." A wind blade had already left the young man's hand, but this time it hit the stone pillar at the other end of the hall, stirring up a cloud of gravel. Sue had already opened the back door in that direction and escaped from there. "Catch her." Rosebud did not expect such an accident to happen and could not help but shout in exasperation. Chapter 1465. The young man did not move, but the Black Knight stood up and chased in that direction. Sir Roseborn tugged at his collar and wanted to follow, but the young man beside him grabbed his arm. "You can't go. We'll be in big trouble if she escapes." "She won't be able to escape. Calm down, my friend. That little girl is at most an iron-ranked warrior. If it's the Banksian's knight, they won't be of much use, but at least they can handle such a small matter." Roseborn thought about it and calmed down. "You're right. Get ready, I'll accompany you to the square." The young man smiled. "Although I don't know who this count is, he should be proud of himself. To think that I would have to play the role of a mortal." He tilted his head. "This feeling, to be honest, is a little strange. He's not a simple human. Be careful, he's quite close to William and Tolman. The ones who should be worried are the Grey Mages. I heard that the fortress designed by the mortal is quite unique." Roseborn could hear the ridicule in the Buga's voice and could not help but laugh. The fortress that the mortal was so proud of was a joke. The square outside the main gate of Castle Abes was already crowded with people. The snow was getting heavier, and the statue of the knight above the fountain in the middle of the square was covered in a thick layer of snow. It was as if a thick layer of cushion had been added to the bronze shoulders, and the long tassels of the helmet were also dyed white. In the nearby bars, people crowded to the window seats, and the square was silent. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone to appear. Haynes sat by the window of the bar and stared at the snowflakes that were melting into water stains on the window lattice. He felt that he had bad luck since he left the wizard. First, he could not find his brother, and the maid of Abes told him that Clint Montoro had moved out for a few days. Abes was so big that he could not search every inch of it. To make matters worse, the road to Paulus and Radnor was blocked by the rebels. He was still safe and sound when he left Erewhon. He was extremely worried about his father in Vladipest, but it was to no avail. After all, even if the rebel army did not surround Fort Paris, as a rising noble who was close to the royal family, he had nowhere to go. Perhaps they could only wait for the war to end, but the future was bleak. Even Her Royal Highness was trapped in Radnor and there was no news of her. Count Tanagel's most capable subordinates, including Amandina, were also not in Abes. For a moment, the young man felt a sense of helplessness. He remembered that he had encouraged Roland when he was in Salnan. He did not expect that the situation between them would change so quickly. In his depression, he could only find a random bar to drink while thinking about his future plans. In short, he must first ascertain the whereabouts of his father, and if he had indeed perished in Frauda, then he must find a way to take his brother away. If Her Royal Highness was able to pull herself together in the future, she should give his family a place to live, right? Just as Hainf was about to get drunk, news about the Count came back. It was as if his luck had changed from that moment onwards. He realized that he had chosen a wise position. In just a short 15 minutes, there were a few people who wanted to pay a high price in exchange for his position. There was even a female swordswoman with a hot figure who boldly threw him a flirtatious glance. But after a painful decision, the young man flatly refused. It was the first time he could see the hero he worshipped in his heart at such a close distance. "Stingy mister, this should be enough, right?" The female swordswoman, who called herself Claudia, sat beside him and squeezed together with him. She used a hoarse voice to whisper in his ear. Miss Claudia, even though the female swordswoman's appearance was average and she wore thick leather armor, it could not hide her hot figure. Hainf only felt that his mouth was dry. He was not a virgin, but this was too much. "Don't mind it," the female swordswoman interrupted him with a smile. "It seems that you are not a native of Tonagel. Are you also interested in the Count? Aren't you also not a native?" Heinz stuttered. You actually don't know. I am a mercenary. In Tonajol, there is no mercenary who does not respect the Count. He stood up for us in the Battle of Abes. Heinz saw the female swordswoman's worshipful expression and could not help but feel jealous. But didn't Abes expel many mercenaries and adventurers? Those notorious fellows, how many normal people do you think would welcome them? I applaud the people of Tonajol for doing so. Claudia replied disapprovingly. Only then did Heinfu come to a realization and nod silently. At this moment, there was a commotion in the crowd. Heinf also saw a group of people appear in the direction of Abes castle. More than 10 black-armored knights escorted someone out from the castle gate behind the drawbridge. His lordship is out. Someone in the crowd shouted. Heinf instantly became excited and even forgot about the beautiful scenery around him. He grasped the lattice of the window and almost leaned his body out to see clearly what the legendary Count was like. The crowd also became excited and the whispers seemed to have quieted down. Then, the people spontaneously chanted the name and honorific that had been passed down from mouth to mouth. The buzzing of voices converged into a torrent. Count Tonajol. The descendant of the sword Saint Darius. Our Lord. It was as if this title alone could eliminate all the uneasiness and fear that had been plaguing them for the past few days. This was the pride of the Tonajol people. This pride made them understand that as long as its owner did not leave them, then today's predicament would become a thing of the past. It would become a memory of yesterday. My lord. My lord. The spontaneous shouts were like a tsunami, rising and falling one after another. Heinf also felt his blood boiling, as if all the difficulties no longer existed. The Count was naturally invincible. What were the Buga people in front of him? He also joined in the shouting. But the swordswoman asked in his ear, "Have you seen the Count?" "Ah, no." Heinf shivered slightly, "But I have heard every rumor about him. He is our kingdom's greatest knight of this era." "Yes," the swordswoman also looked in that direction. "I only saw him once a year ago from afar. The Count is a very special noble." The young man rode on a highland horse from Grenoires, calmly enjoying the cheers of the crowd. "I'm a little surprised," he looked back and said to Sir Rosebin, "this mortal has such a high reputation here. He must be a guy who is good at bewitching people. Mortals see this as a kind of power." Rosebin replied with a cold face, "That's why there are so many deceivers, but they don't understand what real power is." The young man only smiled and shook his head. Clint dragged Roland forward in the fanatical crowd, trying to get closer to the Count, but it was a little futile. Brando shook his head helplessly and pointed with his finger. An invisible force separated the crowd so that they could continue to move forward. The snow was getting heavier and heavier, and the sky was a vast expanse of white. Brando was not as enthusiastic as the two teenagers. He had silently put on his hood. Seeing this, Scarlet also pulled up her gray hood and stood behind him. Both of them saw the Count of Tonajol in the distance. "My lord, should we squeeze past him?" Albert frowned. "That guy must be a fake." "Of course he's a fake." Scarlet gave Albert a slap on the head. "Do I need you to tell me that?" "Big sister, I..." Albert felt that he had been wronged. Wasn't he just trying to make His Excellency angry? He wasn't speaking for the enemy. "Why is Miss Yuta there?" Scarlet frowned and whispered, "Was she deceived or coerced?" "That's not her." Brando shook his head. His face had already darkened. He turned to Albert and the others and said, "Albert, take the Grey Wolves mercenaries to Ab's castle, but don't act rashly. If there are enemies, find out what happened in Ab's castle and what happened to Miss Yuta." "My lord, leave it to me." Albert immediately nodded and whistled. He immediately turned and left in another direction with the rest of the Grey Wolves mercenaries. "Do I have to go too?" Scarlet tightened her grip on the halberd and couldn't help but ask. No, Brando shook his head. Let's wait and see what this guy wants to do. He raised his head and looked in the direction of Abby's castle with a gloomy face. He had to first determine who the other enemies were. For them to be able to enter Tonajol and put on such a show, it definitely wasn't as simple as the nobles of the southern border. Roland and Clint, who were in the front of the group, shivered. What's wrong? Why didn't that wizard follow us? Clint touched his neck and looked behind him strangely. Isn't he with you? Don't worry about him. Roland considered whether to run away, but after thinking about it, he gave up on this futile plan. He's a strange guy. Clint shrugged. Let's walk faster. We're already very close to the Count. Heavens, now I have something to talk about. Let's see if those fellows still dare to pretend to be experienced in front of me. Roland snorted at this little guy's attitude, but he was also a little excited. Although the matters in the north troubled him, at least it wasn't the matter at hand, right? Chapter 1466. Ha! What's wrong? The swordswoman's hoarse voice rubbed against Hain's ear. Nothing, I just saw a few acquaintances. Hainf moved inwards without leaving a trace, which made the swordswoman admire him a little. Hainf, on the other hand, was puzzled. He had seen the wizard, but why was his brother, Clint Montolo, with them? He was hesitating whether to go down and say hello, but there were so many people in the square that he might not be able to find them even if he went down. After hesitating for a while, he still didn't move. Aren't you going to say hello? The swordswoman whispered in his ear. No, no need. Let's talk about it later. Hain Fu could feel several jealous gazes falling on him from the surroundings. The swordswoman smiled slightly. Count Tonajol raised his hand, and the crowd suddenly quieted down. Seeing this scene, Hain secretly admired. I dare say, he said to the swordswoman, in Erewhon, there is no lord with such prestige. I heard that the king's eldest son is also known for his wisdom. This has nothing to do with wisdom, Miss Claudia, but confidence in victory. Do you know why the sword Saint Darius is still remembered by ordinary people after decades? It is because he convinced the people of Cruz. The people of Erewhon need such heroes, as if they can draw courage and confidence from them, to prove that we can also do what the late King Eric did. You know a lot, sir. This praise made Hain feel light, as if his bones were lighter by a few taels. The people of Tonajol stared at their lord, and the young man on the horse enjoyed such gazes. Hain saw the man's age and couldn't help but be surprised, thinking that Count Tonajol was so young. But he saw that the people around him were taking it for granted, so he was embarrassed to raise his doubts, lest he be treated as a country bumpkin. Unfortunately, Hainf didn't have a message in crystal, or he would have written a poem in his current mood. How can I pretend to see Count Tonajol often? Waiting online, it's urgent. The Count of Tonajol wore a silver mask, like a masquerade, but the outline of his lower face was completely familiar. He was silent for a long time. There seemed to be a silent power accumulating in the air. Then he said, I've been away from Cold Shirt for a long time. Many things have happened during this time. You must want to know why. There was a slight commotion in the crowd. This opening was somewhat out of their expectations. Hain Fu was also stunned. This was not the inspiring speech he had imagined. In the plaza, Roland and little Montolo were craning their necks to look in that direction, trying to get a clear look at that Count's face. The Count is so young. Strange, why does he look so familiar? Shoo! Their whispering attracted the angry stares of the people around them. If looks could kill, Scarlet's cold glare would have pierced through the impostor and sent him tumbling off his horse. She retracted her gaze and proceeded to kill the two blind students in front of her. Brando held her hand and turned around to look at the other side of the plaza. The words of Count Tonajol still echoed in the plaza, buzzing. The reason is simple. The young man sneered. He used magic to amplify his every word to the entire Cold Shirt Castle. His voice boomed in the sky. Because someone betrayed me. It was the ungrateful Corvado royal family. Like a gust of wind blowing through the plaza suddenly became silent. Silence. Absolute silence. The plaza where thousands of people gathered was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. Clang! Haynes stood up from his seat, losing his composure. The chair behind him flipped over and tripped him. Haynes fell heavily on the floor. The swordswoman let out a scream and rushed over to help him up from the ground. The commotion here was like the first domino that had fallen, triggering a chain reaction. It was like a bomb had been thrown into the crowd. After a moment of silence, the crowd erupted into noises that were 1,000 times louder than before. It was disbelief, followed by whispers that bordered on panic. More people fell into unease and confusion. They asked each other to make sure that they were not hallucinating. Haynes was lying on the ground, and a voice was buzzing in his head. This is impossible. Erwin is done for. Another gloomy thought hovered in his head. He even ignored the swordswoman's worried face. At that moment, Haynes thought of a black death. The crowd finally stirred. But there was always silence in the midst of the chaos. Roant and little Montolo were like stone statues, standing still on the spot. How? Clint felt like his worldview had collapsed. Roant stood beside him, his eyes flickering with an unknown color. For some reason, the young man from the Redbud family turned around and looked at the wizard. Beside Brando, Scarlet finally could not bear it. How much effort did his lordship spend in Tonagel to get to where he was today? How could she allow others to taint all of it? She just took a step forward, but Brando firmly pressed her shoulder. Brando's face under the hood was unusually calm, as if everything that happened here had nothing to do with him. But in the depths of his dark eyes, the sea was reflecting bright lightning, like the gloomy sky before a storm. People could already foresee the fury of nature. He already understood this set of tricks in his heart and understood the approach of the person who had come. Then all that was left was to settle the score. Don't worry, Scarlet. But his lordship. Don't worry. Brando replied softly. A footstep came from afar. Looking at the restless crowd, every face was filled with anger, uneasiness, and fear. The young man and Rosebud looked at each other and smiled. The plan worked as it should. In order to throw Trondheim into chaos, they had to first destroy the beliefs in the hearts of the people. When they found out that everything they had persevered in the past was a lie, the heroes they had created themselves would be shattered by their own hands. Heroes are synonymous with fragility. When they are born, they are like meteors across the sky, and when they disappear, it is often accompanied by a tragic tragedy. Rosebud sighed. And all of this is the masterpiece of All for One, the young man smiled. Compared to 30 years ago in East Metz, this is not worth mentioning. Tree herders and cruise people were played by you. Dancing with the Fool is nothing to be proud of. Sir Rosebud could not hide his pride. Next, let's add fuel to the fire and let it burn Erwin people. That's right. Happy cooperation. Happy cooperation. The young man narrowed his eyes and rode his horse to the front of the crowd. He was well-mannered, and his every move carried the elegance of a noble. It was a kind of satisfaction, but when he was about to speak, a sharp and calm voice interrupted him. He's lying. When the voice sounded from the crowd for the second time, the square suddenly quieted down. People looked at each other and turned their heads, looking in the direction of the voice. The crowd there avoided it as if it was the plague. A hole spontaneously formed in the crowded square. A girl dressed like a cobbler stood stubbornly in the hole, her hands clenched into fists. She stared at the young man on the horse, her dark brown eyes almost spitting fire. He's not my lord. Like a stone falling into a pool that was as flat as a mirror, a slight wave of uneasiness rippled through the square. "Isn't that Sue, the town's archer?" "I know her, she's the daughter of the copper dragon Redo." "Why is she here?" "She's Lady Freya's close friend, and she seems to be a guest at Coldshirt Castle." The young man's face was as cold as ice, and he cursed the Bansi people in his heart for making him lose face. But it was because of this that he hated the fish that escaped the net. "Sue, you betrayed me and Freya, and you still dare to appear here." He seemed to be laughing out of anger. "Very well." Sue ignored his threat. She was alone and helpless, but she knew that the more she said the better. She could not be fooled by the young man. She said loudly, "My lord has been recognized by the Halran Gaia, and you don't have that in your hands." Ridiculous, a trace of anger flashed in the young man's heart. He did not expect the innkeeper's daughter to be so calm. "Do you think I'll waste my breath on you ungrateful people? Guards, capture her." The black-armored knight immediately parted the crowd and approached the girl. Sue looked at them in panic, but she quickly calmed down. She knew that she could not retreat, and she could not show her fear in front of the people. She had to stand firm in her momentum, and only then would she be able to shake the confusion in the people's hearts. Sue suddenly turned and rushed to the top of the fountain. She climbed up the stairs and called out to everyone of Tonajol, "Do you really think that my lord is such a person? That person is high above, and even killed Lady Yuda. He is not my lord at all. Tonajol people, my sisters and brothers, if you still trust your lord, please stand up and fight for this land. The witches are already on their way, and they will soon expose all the lies of this impostor." The crowd was shaken. They knew that the witches were the count's most loyal subordinates. On the second floor of the inn, Hainf, who was lying on the floor, heard the commotion in the square. In the darkness, the details of his conversation with Roland that night flowed into his heart bit by bit. Chapter 1467. There was more than one Count Tonajol in Erewhon. Everyone could take over this ideal flag. At that moment, he was enlightened. He grabbed the swordswoman's hand, got up, and rushed to the window. He raised his hands high, faced everyone in the square, and shouted with all his strength, "I believe her. I believe her. Everything she said is true." His shout echoed in the square repeatedly, causing everyone to be alarmed. The black-armored knight who was on guard around the square also turned around. They saw Hainfu, pulled out his sword, and walked into the inn with a gloomy expression. "Are you crazy, sir?" The swordswoman pulled Hainfu back with a stunned expression. A few arrows immediately fell on the windowsill. Screams sounded in the inn, and everyone panicked. But at that moment, Hainfu was surprisingly calm. He felt a sacred sense of mission surging in his heart. Instead, he grabbed the swordswoman's wrist and said, "Do you believe me, Lady Claudia? That, although I also feel that the Count is a little strange today." "Believe me," Hainfu interrupted her, "this has nothing to do with who the Count is, and it's not fighting for one person. It's the future of Erewhon." "Are you from Erewhon, Lady Claudia?" "I'm from the mountains." For some reason, the swordswoman looked at the solemn Hainfu, and her heart was filled with a strange feeling. She answered subconsciously, "But I'm also from Erewhon." "Then follow me, we'll fight side by side." Hainfu looked up. On the stairs leading to the second floor of the inn, a few stocky black-armored knight appeared there aggressively. He pulled out the sword at his waist. For Erewhon. In the square, the crowd was completely panicked. They were at a loss and did not understand what was happening. But they had a bad feeling in their hearts. People pushed each other and began to flee in all directions of the square, trying to leave this place. However, the shoving only intensified the chaos in the crowd and even hindered the Black Knight's advance. Sue glanced in that direction and felt that she had achieved her goal. She looked at the window of the inn in surprise, curious as to who had helped her. In the face of this sudden chaos, a trace of anger and panic finally flashed across the young man's face. Sir Roseborn grabbed his hand and said in a low voice, "We can't wait any longer. If we create a massacre and push the blame to the princess, Tonajol will never have peace." The young man nodded heavily. He raised his hand and chanted a wind blade. The sharp cyclone fell into the crowd, and it looked like a tragedy was about to happen. However, at this moment, something strange happened. It was as if the young man was being merciful. When the wind blade fell into the crowd, it didn't cause any damage at all. Instead, it only pushed people to the sides. Damn it! Why are you still so soft-hearted at this time? Roseborn was shocked and angry. I didn't. The young man also panicked and couldn't help but angrily reply. The crowd parted to the left and right, coincidentally revealing Sue in the middle. Seeing this, the young man immediately shouted, "Catch her dash!" A look of panic appeared on Sue's face, and he subconsciously retreated. At this moment, there was a new change in the square. Among the crowd, little Montolo finally recognized the person who shouted in the inn. It was his father's eldest son, Heinf. Why is my elder brother there? Who knows? Roland replied in a bad mood. Oh my God, little Montolo suddenly exclaimed, look at your friend, what is he doing? What kind of friend do I have? What are you making a fuss about? Roland angrily pushed through the crowd, damn it, get out of my way. It's that wizard, oh, Martha above. This is impossible. Roland suddenly turned his head in that direction. He saw that Brando was walking forward, and as if there was an invisible force surrounding him, the crowd automatically parted to the sides. Roland opened his mouth wide. Following Brando's advance, the commotion in the square suddenly quieted down, as if a miracle had happened, and a path was formed in the sea of people. This scene shocked everyone, and more people stopped and turned their heads to see what was happening. What do we do? Little Montolo found that he seemed to have become the center of attention, and immediately panicked. Follow him. Roland gritted his teeth and replied. Why, aren't we on the Count's side? Shut up. In the middle of the square, Sue finally jumped down from the fountain, but because she jumped too quickly, she accidentally sprained her ankle. Two Black Knights chased after her from behind, and the crowd retreated to the left and right. The young girl anxiously turned her head, her face finally showing a look of despair. The two knights drew their swords at the same time, and Sue was about to fall into a pool of blood. But at this moment, the crowd behind her suddenly parted to the left and right, and a person stepped out and raised his right hand. The two knights' movements froze in place. It was a magus. It was a wizard in a brown cloak and a low hood, but he held a sword in his hand. It was a heavy sword with a split blade on both sides. The blade was half an inch thick, and as wide as a palm. The pitch-black blade had silver runes engraved on it. The earth is under his control. That was a different sword after all. The two Bansha knights raised their heads at the same time, the runes on their faces shining brightly. These Cisaldian servants probably did not expect that someone would dare to obstruct them, but what they saw was a pair of dark eyes that were at the same level as the brim of the hood. Those eyes were like the surface of the sea, flashing with a calm and vast radiance. Occasionally, lightning would cut through the clouds, igniting the anger in the depths of the eyes. As I said, everything is sealed in ice, and time and space are orderly. The sharp blade in the hands of a knight, the king and the country, life and death, are separated by eternity, but in reality, it is only a moment. What you are holding is nothing more than decay. Brando said calmly. With a light cracking sound, the Bansha knight was shocked to find that a layer of frost had formed on the magic swords in their hands. An obvious crack had appeared on the swords made of fine gold, and then, with a crisp sound like glass shattering, the swords turned into worthless metal shards. Brando came to their side and pushed them forward. The two of them collapsed like stone statues. They still had their mouths agape, their pupils dilated, and their hearts stopped beating. The young man on horseback finally noticed what was happening here. "Who are you?" he shouted at Brando. "I should be the one asking you that." Brando slowly took off his hood, revealing his true appearance. He raised his head against the wind and snow, his long hair fluttering in the wind. Suddenly, there were sounds of people sucking in cold breaths. Little Montolo and Roland had just separated from the crowd and walked out. They could not help but look around curiously. They were behind Brando, and for a moment, they did not understand why their surroundings had suddenly become quiet. The young man squinted his eyes deeply. "This is good, Mr. Roseborn," his tone contained anger. "Since the original owner is here, we will kill this mortal here, and it will be the same for our plan." But this time, he did not get a response. Sir Roseborn was strangely silent. But at this moment, they could not stop, not to mention that he was just a mortal. The funny thing was that the other party was pretending to be a wizard in front of him. No one dared to call themselves a wizard in front of the Buga people. The young man made a gesture, and the knight around the square immediately surrounded them, holding long halberds in their hands and killing in the direction of Brando. Dragon Knight. Little Montolo was shocked. He found that the knight who surrounded him was the elite force of the Royal Knight Regiment. This was a military force that the royal faction rebuilt after the Ampere Seal War. Its members were all the top experts of the Royal Knight Regiment, and also included some of the outstanding Ranger Knights in Erewhon. The strength of this elite knight was not inferior to the main force of the White Lion Knight Regiment, and even surpassed it. But because they were the elites of the elites, they were not classified as a regular unit, and there was no such thing as a unit rating. But he found that the wizard did not seem to see this. He stood in the same place expressionlessly, blocking in front of Sue. Just this calmness alone made little Montolo feel convinced. "Roland," Brando suddenly said, "I ask you, what kind of Erewhon do you want?" "What?" Roland stared blankly at his back. "You are the son of the Count of Redbud, and if there are no accidents, you will inherit this title and territory in the future. This kingdom will go according to your wishes, and you will become a member of this circle and protect its interests," Brando replied quietly, "but you are still just a country bumpkin, and you will not be able to raise your head in front of the people of Cruz. You can only stay in this small kingdom, content with your corner, and live a drunken life. Do you want to be a frog at the bottom of a well, or a man of Erewhon who can hold his head high?" Brando raised his hand. All the swords in a blacksmith's workshop near the square resonated with a buzzing sound. They suddenly flew across half the square and landed in front of Brando with a clatter. Brando pulled out a sharp sword from among them expressionlessly. He only held the sword in his hand, but it was as if there were layers of light imprinted on the sword, forming a narrow beam of light. It was so sharp that it made people's hair stand on end. He turned the sword around and handed it to Roland. "If you want to be proud of this land, and let your homeland prove your glory, you should pick up the hot blood in your heart, and not face the dying old past. Listen to your heart, it will tell you how to choose. If you are still Roland, the man who wants to be proud of Erewhon, then take this sword and fight with all those who obstruct your ideals. The road ahead is always full of difficulties and obstacles, and a smooth road is definitely not the path a knight should choose." Chapter 1468. Roland was stunned. The surrounding people also held their breaths. The sword he saw seemed to no longer be a sword. It reflected his family, his ideals, and the great country he saw in his dreams. In the midst of his chaotic thoughts, he firmly grasped the hilt of the sword. At that moment, his body suddenly trembled, his eyes widening as he abruptly raised his head. "Sir," this sword," Brando nodded to him. At that moment, the hesitation in Roland's heart seemed to disappear, and his face seemed to be filled with a sacred and solemn color. The three Dragon Knight had already rushed in front of him, and the latter had already stepped in front of Brando to block him. The Dragon Knight did not recognize Roland, but even if they recognized him, he was holding a weapon in his hand. It looked like a very ordinary longsword. The three of them pointed their halberds at Roland, but the latter only blocked their path with a single slash, and actually counterattacked without defending. The Dragon Knight was shocked, thinking that this guy was crazy. The halberds in their hands clearly held the advantage in such a desperate battle. But in the next moment, they stabbed empty air. Roland's figure was still in the same place, and the halberds had already pierced through his body, but they did not feel like they had stabbed a physical body. An illusion. The Dragon Knight did not expect to experience such high-level swordsmanship from an unknown opponent, but suddenly, one of them let out a blood-curdling scream. A terrifying wound appeared on the chest of that Dragon Knight, blood gushing out. Under his frightened and disbelieving gaze, the long sword in the hands of Roland's illusion pierced through his heart. This was 9 Luminaries sword art. Little Montoro was almost scared out of his wits. Ever since Count Trondheim became famous, his swordsmanship was gradually known by everyone, and the most legendary swordsmanship among them was none other than the long-lost inheritance of the Wind Elves. 9 Luminaries sword art. As expected, Roland's phantom split into 3. Although his swordsmanship wasn't as agile and talented as Petit Finus, nor was it as calm and composed as Phoenix was, his style was abnormally unyielding. It was like a gust of wind passing through, only attacking and not defending. This style combined with the 9 Luminaries sword art, actually displayed an unexpected battle prowess. Although the Dragon Knight was powerful, after unexpectedly losing one of their members, the remaining 2 were no match for such a legendary swordsmanship. Not to mention, the ordinary steel sword in Roland's hand was like a godly weapon that could cut through iron like mud. After a few exchanges of blows, the halberds in their hands were reduced to short halberds. In the next moment, Roland used the wounds on his abdomen and thigh to cleanly kill the 2 of them. "Roland, your swordsmanship!" Little Montolo shouted in disbelief. "Heavens, what have you experienced in the past few months?" Roland himself seemed to have woken up from a dream. His body was bathed in blood, and he was so excited that he couldn't control himself. "Milord, this sword. It's called faith," Brando replied. "In front of true faith, there's nothing in this world that can't be broken." Roland lowered his head, deep in thought. Brando didn't even look at the Dragon Knight that was coming from other directions, and said to little Montolo, "Clint, why did you come to Tonagel?" "Of course it's for the Count, for Erwin." Little Montolo answered without hesitation. Brando nodded, and took out another long sword. When the long sword passed through his hand, it was similarly sharp. He handed the sword to the little boy and said, "This is your Erwin, go fight for it." But little Montolo looked in the direction of the square. Although everything that happened here today confused him, he still hesitated. Brando turned around, his back facing the Dragon Knight, and faced little Montolo. He said to the little boy sternly, "I'm very grateful for your loyalty and trust, Clint, but go fight for yourself." A knight should be loyal to his own ideal. Little Montolo's eyes widened. He looked at the young man in front of him in disbelief. At that moment, he finally remembered why he found this wizard familiar. Because his portrait, his statue, was in every corner of Castle Abes. Brendel smiled faintly. "Be careful." Little Montolo suddenly saw the Dragon Knight launching an attack behind Brando. He subconsciously took the long sword and blocked the enemy. But at that moment, it was as if the sky and earth of the square had dimmed. In the darkness, the only thing people could see was a straight silver line extending forward, dividing the world into 2. When little Montolo came back to his senses, his enemies had all fallen to the ground. All of their wounds were on their throats. This is Flash Strike Sword Art. The young man finally reacted and screamed, "Damn it, why do you know Flash Strike Sword Art?" In this world, there are many people who have mastered this kind of skill and knowledge. Brando turned around again and looked up at him calmly. It's not only the Bugas who are worthy of pride. Although the silver folk are favored by the heavens, it's a pity that your actions have tarnished such glory. This sentence finally made the young man feel a chill that went deep into his bones. He looked back at Sir Rosebin and roared, "Who the hell is he, and how does he know all this?" But the young man suddenly stopped talking because he saw the originally proud all-for-one believer, Sir Rosebin, had a pale face and his gums were chattering. He finally understood why he did not get a response from the other party before. "Damn it, do you have to be so afraid? He's just a mortal," the young man could not help but rage. He turned back and looked at Brando coldly. "I admit that you've turned the tables, human, but this is where your ignorance lies. You know who we are and still dare to show up. I admire your courage, and I'll let you see why the Bugas are called Silver Folk Wizards. Kill him!" The young man roared. Suddenly, 7 or 8 wizards in grey robes rose from the buildings around the square. But looking at these colleagues, the young man was not happy at all. He did not intend to use these backup forces, which meant that their methods of bewitching people were completely ineffective. But the effect of killing the Count was the same, it would just be a little embarrassing. When little Montolo saw these wizards, he could not help but scream, "Grey wizards! Count, go quickly, they are the elite wizards of the Cisaldians." But next to him, Roland could not help but grin. He had seen the mentor of these 7 or 8 grey wizards. And that man was now imprisoned in the Druid's Tree prison in the Loop of Trade Winds, and he was almost half crazy. Brando looked at the young man calmly, as if he did not see the threat in the sky. He opened his mouth and replied, word by word. "This is what I want to say to you, Cisaldian. The account between me and you has just begun to be settled, arrogant." The young man felt that this guy was simply unreasonable. He tore off the mask on his face and threw it to the ground. Although his appearance was changed to be exactly the same as Brando's with illusion, people could see that this man's eyes had a layer of silver irises. That was the most distinctive feature of the silver folk, which could not be concealed even with magic, just like their blood. There was a burst of exclamations in the square. And it was at this time that the grey wizards in the air finally launched their attack. Chants intertwined in the air above the square, and silver lightning flashed. The square was filled with screams, and the people panicked once again. But Brando only glanced at this scene indifferently. He turned his hand and inserted Halran Gaia into the ground of the square, and another long sword appeared in his hand. When the young man saw that sword, he felt the hair all over his body stand on end. It was a thin sword less than 3 feet long, with a thin blade that seemed to flicker with a pale blue light. Its guard was an ice sculpture of a fairy spreading its wings and about to fly. It spread wings wrapped around the hilt of the holy sword. The sword's hammer was a gem called Frost Storm. The young man had only heard of the sword's name in legends. It was the soul of the shallow sea, the azure holy sword, the frost chant, Sinna. He had once asked his mentor the meaning of the sword's name, but the white-haired old man looked at him as if he was an idiot and told him, "When you face this sword, you will understand the meaning of its name." The young man felt that he was really an idiot at this moment. He raised his head and screamed at his colleagues in the air, "Get out of the way." But it was too late. Brando swung the holy sword upwards, and snowflakes were falling from the sky above Castle Abes. When the sword pointed to the sky, the snowstorm suddenly reversed, and even the snow on the ground was lifted up, forming an inverted glacier. And the ice and snow in the sky seemed to be controlled by an invisible hand. The north wind screamed, and it was like the melodious song of the legendary Ice Queen. When the blue light swept across the entire sky, the grey mages did not even have time to react. They realized that the lines of law that they were controlling had also been frozen. Their magical light shields were frozen into solid powder in the extreme cold, and the powder fell to the ground. Their faces still maintained the last moment of surprise, and then their bodies exploded, turning into dry snow powder and scattered on the ground. Brando put down the sword. The snowstorm stopped in an instant. The dark clouds in the sky parted, and a ray of sunlight fell on the square. At that moment, the whole square was silent. Everyone, including Roant and little Montolo, looked at this scene in a daze. Chapter 1469. The young man finally showed a look of horror, but he did not think of running away. He did not know how to explain the loss of 7 or 8 bugas to Sard. In his rage, he could only attribute all of this to Brando's fault. He was just a mortal, but he did not resign himself to death. He pulled out a short emerald staff from under his coat and pointed it at Brando angrily. "You dare to murder a noble silver folk." Sir Roseborn finally reacted and rushed forward to grab his hand, saying hoarsely, "Run." However, the red-eyed young man almost threw him off his horse. "Shut up, you useless idiot. You cowardly infidel. If you don't want to fight, then get out of my way." Roseborn retreated with a gloomy face. He took one last look at the young man and finally decided to turn around and leave. But he did not expect the young man to turn around and raise his staff at him, and a green light hit his back. Roseborn screamed and fell off his horse, struggling on the ground in pain. "A coward does not deserve to live." The young man sneered cruelly. Brendel calmly watched the two dogs biting each other from beginning to end. "No one is born noble," Brando replied quietly. "Everyone is noble because of their actions." At this moment, the dark clouds in the sky parted, and a golden floating light appeared above the square. And Brando was right in the middle of the square. The people of Tonajol watched the scene quietly. Sue knelt behind the young lord, holding her ankle, her face full of confusion and disbelief. She loved Miss Freya deeply and had always disliked the man who stole her heart, but today she realized for the first time that he might not be completely useless. The young man grinned and pointed his short staff at Brando. He wanted to see how many times Cinna could save this human. "Be careful." "Roland," young Montolo shouted at the same time, and the last was Sue's voice. Scarlet's actions were even more direct. She activated the bloodline of the Thunder God, and lightning zigzagged in all directions. Her cloak was instantly reduced to ashes, revealing her silver breastplate and her fiery red ponytail. "It's Miss Chien!" someone in the crowd exclaimed. The mountain girl took a step forward and threw the halberd in her hand at the young man. The silver halberd was surrounded by electric sparks and collided with the green beam in midair. Both were reduced to nothingness at the same time. But in the next moment, the electric sparks that filled the sky returned to Scarlet's hand and turned back into the halberd. The azure lance, the bloodline of the dragon, the blood of the thunder god. The young man's laughter was stuck in his throat. He finally recognized the girl's identity. Brando did not even look at the short cane in the young man's hand. Some people will never understand. He reached out his hand and pulled the young man up like he was pulling a duck from a distance of over 100 meters. When the young man realized that he had lost control of his body, he collapsed. He felt that this was impossible. A mortal sage must be an illusion. There was a terrible silence in the square. Only the sound of people gasping could be heard. Those were the bugas of the silver folk. It was said that each of them could activate their elemental powers, and the adults had at least the strength of the elemental enlightenment. Among them, there was no lack of supreme champions and sages. Among the 12 wizard leaders, the strongest 3 had perfect bodies and entered the realm of demigods. Their population was not large, but they were still the top forces of this world. The people of such a race were like a dead duck being held in the hands of their lord, held up more than 100 meters away. Someone even slapped himself lightly on the face to make sure that it was not an illusion. That person was little Montolo. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry at the action of this clown. He directly blocked the young man's connection with the magic network. This was the ability of the sage's domain, permanent elemental solidification. The swords he had given to Roland and little Montolo earlier used this ability. Although his current master's degree was far from enough to make divine weapons, as long as he had the heart, making 1 or 2 fantasy weapons would not be a problem. This was the power of the sage. Brando threw the young man aside like a dead dog, then turned back to check on Sue's condition. Fortunately, the girl had only sprained her ankle. He helped Sue up, and the latter said to him tiredly, "My lord, Miss Yude, she's fine." Brando had already received the news from Albert that the Grey Wolves mercenaries had intercepted Yude in Cold Shirt Castle. Although the latter was seriously injured, he had expected Albert to take away the angel's heart vase and some holy water, which came in handy. After hearing the news, Sue seemed to have overdrawn all her energy, completely relaxed, and fell asleep with her head down. Brando knew that she was overly nervous and carefully handed her to Scarlet, then slowly walked across the square to the young man and Sir Roseborn. Throughout the whole process, everyone in the square quietly looked at their lord. Brando raised his head. The Banksian's knight brought by the young man had already scattered, and the dragon knight of the royal faction had also been killed. He remembered seeing a guy disguised as Yuta earlier, but now there was no trace of him. He faintly felt that the person was a bit strange, but there was no need to pursue it for the time being. Brando lowered his head. Sir Rosborn's face was ashen, and he was about to take his last breath. Save me, you should know that this is impossible." Brando replied. Sir Rosborn's face changed several times, and finally showed a look of despair. Brando half knelt beside him, rolled up his sleeve, and revealed his pale right hand. He used 2 fingers to gently stroke his index finger, and there was a flash of light, revealing a silver ring. It was a snake, head and tail connected. Brando lifted his right hand, gently removed the ring, and then placed it on Sir Rosborn's chest. He placed his left hand on the ring and said softly, "All things return to one, all things return to the ring, the will of truth is with you and me." Sir Roseborn looked at all this in astonishment, and he said hoarsely, What's wrong?" "Roseborn, you chose the wrong path," Brando replied, "so you were betrayed. Don't you have anything to say? Tell me, I will listen." The young man on the side struggled violently, and Roseborn also showed a struggling expression. His chest suddenly rose and fell violently a few times, and he looked at the young man with a look of resentment. The Buga's plan to plunge Erewhon into civil strife. They assassinated Prince Levin Wunsen. This man and another man participated in the operation. You assassinated His Highness Levin. And his maid Edessa. We didn't do anything. The whole operation was arranged by the Bugas alone. Roseborn gasped like a broken bellows, and dark red blood overflowed from his mouth and nose. Brando didn't say anything. He recalled the king's eldest son whom he had met once in Ampere Seal. The other party described his expectations for the future of Erewhon in his letter. Brando knew that he had missed his dream, but he didn't expect fate to play a malicious joke on him. He once joked that it would be difficult for him to meet the hero who changed Erewhon in his life. Originally, with the dragon's blood pool, he hoped to cure the king's eldest son's eyes, but he didn't expect this joke to come true. Damn you all. When little Montolo heard the news, he angrily pulled out his sword and was about to stab Roseborn. But Brando instructed Scarlet to hold him firmly. He's going to die, Brando said softly. Little Montolo let out a low roar of resentment and kicked the young man next to him, causing him to tumble. This time, no one stopped him. Even with the physical fitness of the Bugas, the young man's mouth was bleeding, so one could imagine how powerful little Montolo's kick was. The young man didn't say a word, but he was secretly annoyed. If he knew this would happen, he would have let Roseborn go, so as to avoid unnecessary trouble. Brando pressed on Roseborn's chest and asked, "How did they enter Tonagel? Who met them?" "It was me." "And?" Roseborn's eyes were completely unfocused, and he murmured almost unconsciously, "And Oberway, Oberway?" Brando's heart sank. "Count Oberway, enough, shut up." The young man finally couldn't help but speak. But little Montolo angrily punched him in the lower abdomen, and the young man bent over in pain. But his words seemed to wake Roseborn up. He made a sound, and his hands seemed to want to grab something in the sky. This action stopped there, and Brando felt that Roseborn's heartbeat had completely stopped. Only then did he sigh. His spell was too low level. Although he took advantage of the situation, the effect was still not deep enough. He glanced at Roseborn's body, and there was no sympathy in his heart. It wasn't that he couldn't save this person, he just didn't want to. "Oh no!" Little Montolo suddenly jumped up. "Count Oberway is organizing the defense in Parise, if he betrays Her Highness the Princess." Brando's heart also flashed with a trace of haze. Although Roseborn's words might not be completely credible, he didn't want to believe that Oberway would betray the royal family. "How long has it been since the rebels surrounded Parise?" 3 days. "When did Count Oberway arrive at Palace?" "Also 2 days ago." "Is there any news from Mente?" Little Montolo thought for a moment. After all, he wasn't a decision-maker in Abes, and the information he knew wasn't much more than the average person. But at least he was a squire knight, and he knew how to analyze the information. But his expression suddenly changed. "My lord, Lady Maynard seems to be organizing a retreat in Mente. She doesn't know all of this." Brando's expression changed. Chapter 1470. Brando silently sheathed Cinna. After thinking for a while, he instinctively wanted to go to Mente immediately. If Oberway was really unreliable, then Senior Allium Japonicum was undoubtedly in danger. However, he forcefully suppressed his impulse. Brando understood that this was not the time to panic. If Tonagel wanted to win this war, they absolutely had to maintain stability in the rear. He turned around and looked at the young man. The young man noticed Brando's calm gaze and his heart subconsciously shrank. "What else do you want to say?" Brando looked at him and asked calmly. "Wait, you can't kill me," the young man screamed. "I'm the son of Sard Barbarossa. It's not me who will kill you, it's all the crimes you've committed." Brando did not seem to hear him and replied calmly, "Say your last words, for the sake of Lady Martha." "No, I didn't do anything wrong." Realizing that the mortal in front of him was not joking, the young man finally panicked. "I'm a Buga, my father can decide the war in Erewhon." "Wait, don't you understand?" The young man suddenly shut his mouth. Brando's slightly cold hand pressed on his forehead. If you kill me, there's no possibility of this war ending. From the moment you hurt the people of Erewhon, there's no possibility of this war ending," Brando replied calmly. "I sentence you on the charge of murdering a member of the royal family. As a noble of Erewhon, and as the Lord of Tonagel, I grant this sacred right. With Martha as my witness, I declare that you will be sentenced to death." The young man's eyes were filled with infinite fear. He struggled violently, but with a bang, the back of his head suddenly exploded, and red and white matter scattered on the ground. The young man's body twitched and fell on his back. The square was silent. Everyone stared at the scene in a daze. Although Brando had killed 7 or 8 Bugas before, the shock was far less than this scene. This was a public declaration of war against the Bugas, the Sisaldans. Brando turned his head. Every pair of eyes in the square was focused on him. He sighed and raised his hand. Following his movement, the crowd was in a commotion. One hand, two hands, and more hands were raised into fists. Tonajul. It was unknown who shouted loudly. Following which, more voices rang out. My lord. People waved their fists and shouted the name of this territory and his name. Brendel watched all of this in silence, but he gestured with his hand, and everyone quieted down again. I'm not a Tonajul man. After a moment of silence, Brando. His first sentence caused the square to fall into silence again. People gradually put down their hands and looked at their lord in confusion. What does the lord want to say? Brando's gaze was also focused on his people. Although he had never invested too much effort in the territory, everything that Tonajul had now was mostly due to the Roman and Amandina's efforts. Although the merchant lady was trapped on the other side of the world crystal wall, and Amandina and the princess were also trapped in Ranner and had no news of them. But Brando's heart was not gloomy. Erwin was not just one hero. It was the efforts of many people who had created the scene today. Although some of them may never see all of this again, such as His Highness Levin Ornessen, and the heroes who had been buried in the previous wars to protect Erwin. Although many people were deep in the mire, fighting and killing with the difficulties and obstacles now and in the future. He continued, his voice steady and calm, but it was enough to spread throughout the square. I'm not an Ulcenian. The blood of the Highland Knight flows in my veins. I'm also not a Caligo man, because I grew up in the mountains of Bucci. But I'm a Erwin man. He pointed at everyone. You too. You should not only be proud of Tonajul, but also of Erwin. Because without this ancient kingdom, Tonajul is nothing. This is a land where heroes grew up. Everything you have today is the efforts of the people of the past. And everything that Erwin has in the future depends on our efforts now. Is it the royal faction and the nobles of Erwin's past who gave you everything? Brando shook his head. Proud Erwin men, why do you let others decide the fate of the kingdom? This is not a laughable palace struggle, but the road to the kingdom's revival. He looked at everyone in the square with a calm and profound gaze, and said to them, people of Erwin, go and revive this kingdom. From now on, it will no longer belong to those short-sighted nobles and lords who colluded with foreign enemies. This is a war that belongs to each and every one of you. When you set foot on this land, your pride will drive you to fight. When you understand that this is a war of Erwin men, and not a laughable fight between nobles, glory will belong to each and every one of you. And glory, Brando replied softly, will belong to our country. He raised his right hand. Erwin. Everyone in the square had tears in their eyes. They shouted wildly, as if they were about to throw themselves into this holy war. It was as if some kind of fire had been ignited in the darkness, shining in everyone's hearts. Roland looked deeply at this scene. It was a scene that appeared repeatedly in his dreams. The glorious flag, the battle of his father's generation, the Erwin in his dreams. Little Montolo was already so excited that he could not control himself. He said loudly, please let me follow you, my lord. I want to go to Maxon Hill immediately. Brando only glanced at them. Go to Valhalla. Everything you want is there. In the inn, Heinf and the swordswoman Claudia were lying on the floor, gasping for breath. The black-armored knight had already retreated. They quietly listened to the cheers in the square. Heinf suddenly turned around and noticed that the swordswoman was also looking at him. Her dark eyes were filled with affection. He reached out his hand and clasped the swordswoman's slender fingers. Marry me, Lady Claudia. No matter what, I want to marry you. Heinf took a deep breath and said softly. But we've only met once, Mr. Noble. Besides, I'm just a mercenary. Is that still important? The two silently looked at each other. Then they hugged and kissed. Martha above, those fellows from Canage did not lie to us. There really is a world tree here. A wizard could not help but exclaim. 7 to 8 grey-robed wizards were standing in the bleak winter shrubs. They were all looking at the magnificent scene in the valley not far away in amazement. A towering tree stood in the middle of the valley. It was so huge and slender that its branches were even taller than the mountains. The hills of Shaflund were nothing but shallow mounds under its roots. A city was faintly discernible under the huge roots of the giant tree. It was surrounded by tall city walls, towers and fortresses, streets and buildings, and patches of red and green roofs. The road leading to the hills was like a spider web, radiating in all directions. What a waste! A wizard shook his head. I really don't know what the druids of the world ring are thinking. Why would they give such a thing to mortals? Look at their city, it's so crude it makes one's hair stand on end. It's the same with the magic barrier. It'll break with a poke. Another replied. Those mortals still call this place the final fortress. What a pitiful fellow. Their knowledge is probably limited to the battles between mortals. At least it's not bad here. This is the border of civilization. In this small kingdom, even units like the Wyvern Knight are hard to come by. That thing is not even as good as the grey gargoyles that the Canage eliminated a few years ago. Everyone had a look of pity on their faces. All right, put away your sense of superiority. The leader of the wizards said, we are not here to look down on mortals. They are not born lowly. No matter who the opponent is, we are only loyal to our mission. The wizards collected their emotions. The pride of the Silver Folk was indeed innate and did not need to be embellished by external factors. They knew that they were being sarcastic, but they rarely took it seriously. The pride that came from the bloodline was far less convincing than the achievements that were acquired. After all, the Bugis did not need to compare themselves with mortals to show their extraordinariness. Except for a few, but this place is too big. A wizard frowned and said, we don't have time to scan this place. Although they still had a choice, they could use string magic to completely destroy the city and achieve their goal. But this was a civilized world after all, and their enemy was not the barbarians. Using magic to kill tens of thousands of civilians was an option that the wizards subconsciously ruled out in their minds. Like us, mortals take pride in being close to the sky. That's why they built their religious buildings so tall and big. The leader of the wizards replied, let's search from top to bottom. I saw a square in the canopy. It's obviously not an insignificant place. How are we going to get there? Are we going to fly there? No, are you crazy? Another wizard retorted, that's too conspicuous. The leader of the wizards shook his head as well. He looked at one side of the canopy, where huge branches grew horizontally like a bridge. A spherical cavity was naturally formed in the canopy, where countless silver floating battleships were moored. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.